Hello everyone, a very good evening and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep. Welcome to another session on international relations. Before we begin, don't forget this Saturday we shall have a doubt clearing session for international relations. The timings will be communicated to you. We'll start early in the morning, we'll wrap up the entire syllabus for IR, and then we shall take up all the doubts and questions that you have on international relations. But please remember, for your doubts to be answered, you have to send your doubts to iaslive at the rate byjuice.com. You cannot ask impromptu questions in the session. Now itself, make a list of all the questions you have and send a mail to iaslive at byjuice.com. So these questions will be picked up and we'll answer them, we'll discuss them in detail on Saturday. So don't forget this. So let's begin today's discussion. Let's start with India's ties with Mauritius and Seychelles. We are at the last part of the Indian Ocean region. In the last two classes, we have studied Indian Ocean and East Africa in detail. We have covered our ties with Sri Lanka and Maldives, and we have studied some important groupings of the region as well. So let's wrap up and close this chapter today by finishing Mauritius and Seychelles. These are relatively smaller topics, so we can cover them quickly. And also, now that you have understood what is our focus in Indian Ocean and you have studied our ties with Sri Lanka and Maldives, Mauritius and Seychelles will become very easy and simple. The approach is exactly the same, the priorities are the same. So we just have to go through the relations India has with these two island countries. So let's start with India Mauritius. Mauritius is a small island nation located in the Indian Ocean region. It's quite far away from India geographically, but still we treat Mauritius as an extended neighbor of India. Geographically speaking, Mauritius is part of Africa. It's an Indian Ocean country. It's an Indian Ocean country located in the western part of Indian Ocean, and it is considered to be part of the African continent. So it's a member of many important African groupings, including the African Union, which has been in the news recently. So India gives a lot of priority to its ties with Mauritius because we consider Mauritius to be a neighboring country, even though it's not a neighbor. It's not part of South Asia. We don't share any boundaries with Mauritius. Even though it's located thousands of kilometers away near Africa, still India considers Mauritius as a neighbor, as an extended neighbor of India. So, what is the reason behind that? Why do we consider Mauritius to be so close to India? There must be some reason. The answer lies in the close cultural connect between the two countries. We share deep rooted civilizational cultural links with this island nation. If you look at the population of Mauritius, almost 68% of the country's population, they are of Indian origin. Majority of the country's population, they are of Indian descent. This is the primary reason why Mauritius is so close to India. You might have recently seen the G20 summit that India hosted. We had invited several guest countries as well, like Bangladesh, Egypt, UAE, and other important countries were invited by India as guest countries to participate in the G20 summit. Mauritius was one of the guest countries. In the G20 summit hosted by India, we had invited the leader of Mauritius. Right? You would have seen the leader of Mauritius taking part in the event, right? Participating in discussions. So India gave this opportunity to Mauritius because we consider Mauritius to be extremely crucial in our foreign policy, especially with regard to our policy towards the Indian Ocean. The prime reason why Mauritius gets this importance is because of the close people to people relations that we share. Almost 68% of the country's population is of Indian origin, right? The leader of Mauritius who visited India, right? Look at his name. His name is Jagannath, a clear name of Indian origin, right? In Mauritius, you find Hinduism to be very a dominant religion. The Hindi language, the Bhojpuri dialect, right? And even Tamil and Malayalam are widely spoken in Mauritius by a large number of people. So there is a deep rooted cultural connection that exists here. So this is what binds India and Mauritius together. And also, given its location, its strategic location in the Indian Ocean, the country becomes very, very important for India. So again, you can see how geography is playing a role in geopolitics, right? There is a human geography angle. The demography of the country is of great interest to India. There is a very strong Indian community with whom we share very close connection, right? That is one driver of the relationship, along with the strategic location of Mauritius, which makes it very, very important from a geopolitical point of view. These are the two factors why Mauritius is important for India, and we treat Mauritius as an extended neighbor of India. Now, let's study this relationship in slight detail. Let's understand what initiatives we have that are focused on Mauritius, what recent developments have taken place, what is the historical background, right? Do we have any issues or concerns in the relationship? Let's study all the aspects of this relationship in detail. First, let me show you where exactly Mauritius is located. We saw this yesterday as well. Let me just refresh your memory. You can see here in the western part of Indian Ocean, in the southwest part of Indian Ocean, you have this small island nation called Mauritius. This is where it is located. It's right next to the French territory, that is French Reunion. It's next to Madagascar. You also have countries like Comoros, Seychelles that are located nearby. It's very close to Diego Garcia Naval Base, which is owned by the US. This is actually a British Indian Ocean territory. These group of islands that you see here, which are owned by Britain, which is leased to US, this is part of the Chagos archipelago of islands. Chagos Islands are claimed by Mauritius. Historically, they belong to Mauritius itself. But during colonial times, Britain had taken over the Chagos group of islands, and it has never quit the Chagos Islands. Even today, this is a British territory given on lease to the United States for establishing a military base. So there is a standing international dispute here between Mauritius and United Kingdom. Mauritius has challenged the control of Diego Garcia and the Chagos Islands by Britain and US and has raised this issue at the United Nations. There is a territorial dispute here which is connected to colonial history, colonial origin. Even though Britain decolonized all its colonies across Asia and Africa, it refused to give up the Chagos Islands because of its strategic value. These islands were an important military base for Britain during the Second World War. After the Second World War, Britain leased these islands to US, and since then the US has set up a major naval base at Diego Garcia. So because of these strategic reasons, US and UK, right, they're working together to keep control of this island, and they've refused to give up their sovereignty, and they've refused to respect the wishes of Mauritius. So that's why Mauritius has raised this as an international dispute, and this becomes a challenge for India. India gets caught in between. Since Mauritius is a close friend and partner, Mauritius asks for India's help to get back Chagos from Britain. But since India is a close friend of Western countries like US and Britain, it becomes a very challenging situation, a dilemma for India. From India's perspective, the US military base and the presence of British forces as well is a positive development for us because we are trying to counter the Chinese influence. So the presence of the American Navy and the presence of Britain, also the presence of France nearby, this is a good development for India because we can align with them and jointly we can counter Chinese aggression. But problem comes up when Mauritius raises the demand for claiming sovereignty over Chagos, right? So India gets caught in between this dispute over Chagos, where we have to choose between Mauritius and Britain. We have tried taking a middle ground. We have not directly interfered in this dispute. We have allowed this dispute to take place between Mauritius and Britain. But this remains a standing issue and India gets dragged into it. So this is something you should be aware of. You already know the significance of East Africa, right? East Africa is of great strategic significance for India for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, and even for defense and strategic reasons. Now, between Madagascar, which is a large island, right? Between Madagascar and East Africa, you can see a water body here, right? Between Mozambique and Madagascar, there is this water body which is part of the Indian Ocean. This is a very, very important shipping lane. Do you know what is this water body known as? Does anyone know what is this water body here between Madagascar and Mozambique? Pratyaksh and Bavi and even Aditya have given the right answer. Very good. Even Mohammed, Garvit, they've all given the right answer. Very good. This is the Mozambique Channel. The Mozambique Channel is this narrow water channel connecting Indian Ocean with the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and towards the Atlantic. Now remember, during the colonial times, when Portugal, then the Danish, then French, the British, when they explored the sea route towards India and Asia, right, their ships were navigating across Europe. They would circumnavigate across the Europe and African continent, then reach South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and take a turn. And ships would pass through Mozambique Channel to find a shorter route towards Indian Ocean to reach India. For many centuries, for many decades, this was a vital shipping channel. Even today, Mozambique Channel has great importance for shipping. After the Suez Canal was built here in Egypt, a shorter route was created between Europe and Indian Ocean. Right? Once Suez Canal was built, a shorter direct route opened from Mediterranean to Red Sea, where the ships could directly reach Arabian Sea via Bab el-Mandeb Strait. But until then, the Mozambique Channel was a critical route. It would provide a shorter route for ships arriving from the Atlantic, from Europe towards India. Even today, Mozambique Channel has a lot of importance with regard to global shipping traffic. It remains a choke point, and this channel remains relevant for Indian interests as well. As I told you, Indian Navy is constantly deployed in East Africa as well to help out Mozambique, Kenya, and Tanzania, which are affected by natural disasters. Even Seychelles, right? They're all affected by natural disasters, especially tropical cyclones that form in the Indian Ocean. And we always send disaster management assistance. We deploy the Indian Navy here near the Mozambique Channel. So this is a region which is close to the piracy belt near Somalia. And we studied that in East Africa, terrorism has become a concern. Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have got a lot of influence in Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique. Recently, Islamic State had raised its presence in Mozambique. It occupied an entire city in Mozambique. So across this belt, radicalism and terrorism has become an emerging concern. There is a strong Indian diaspora, Indian community in East Africa. So relations with all these countries is crucial for Indian interests in Africa and in the Indian Ocean. Is that clear? We have many Indian companies investing and operating in these countries. There are a lot of Indian workers who travel to these countries who have settled here from many generations. In Tanzania, you have a small island called Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a very important island located here. It belongs to Tanzania. So at Zanzibar, since the colonial period, since the days of the slave market, that slave trade that existed, India has had a connection with Zanzibar. All right. There were Gujarati financiers who would sponsor the slave trade. They would work with the Omani Sultanate, which ruled and controlled all these areas many centuries ago. They would enable the slave trade where the colonial companies like East India Company, they would purchase and sell African slaves. So since those times, we have had connections with East Africa, with Tanzania, with Zanzibar. Now, why am I mentioning all this? How is it related to Mauritius? How is it related to our foreign policy towards Africa and Indian Ocean? It is very relevant because recently IIT Madras IIT Madras has decided to open its first offshore campus in Zanzibar. Please make a note of this development. It happened just a few weeks back. IIT Madras has signed a contract, a deal with Tanzania through the government of India, and its first foreign campus, offshore campus, will come up here on this island of Zanzibar. Even today, you have Indian communities present here. There are Gujarati families and other Indian families settled here from generations. So we are promoting our soft power influence, working on our cultural relations, promoting our economic ties. So to work closely with East African countries, countries like Mauritius become critical for our foreign policy. Mauritius is quite influential in African geopolitics. It is a member of several important regional groupings, including the African Union and other regional organizations in Africa. So, with the help of Mauritius, we can guide and push Indian foreign policy towards Africa. In a way, Mauritius is like a gateway, it's a launch pad for our African diplomacy. We can launch our African diplomacy from this region. We can take the help of Mauritius to gain influence in important African groupings like African Union. There are other important regional economic groupings like SADC, the Southern African Development Council. You might have heard about COMESA and ECOWAS. All these are regional economic groupings in Africa. All right, ECOWAS is an economic grouping of West African states. The West African countries are part of this economic grouping. COMESA is a community, it's an economic community of Eastern and Southern African countries. India works very closely with all these African groupings and African nations. Let me just give you some more insight here. It's very interesting to learn this. Do you know that India's medical industry and pharma industry, our healthcare sector, it has become the backbone of Africa's healthcare sector. Africa's healthcare is directly dependent on India's healthcare industry. India is the pharmacy of the world, right? We produce the largest number of vaccines. We produce the largest number of generic drugs. These are non-patented drugs, which are cheaper in cost, which is affordable in poor countries and developing countries. So these are countries of the global south. Across Africa, there is rampant poverty. There is illiteracy, lack of education, poor healthcare. There are multiple diseases that thrive in Africa even today. Across Africa, there are civil wars, conflicts going on. In such a region, right, countries like India play a critical role. In fact, Africa is blessed with immense resources. Since centuries, Western countries have kept their eyes on African resources. European powers like Britain and France, then US, and now China, they've always tried exploiting African resources just for their own benefit. They've always pursued unilateral relations. They've been very selfish when it comes to Africa without caring much about its development and progress. Right? All the investments these powers have made is largely designed to exploit African resources to power their growth. In fact, imperialism continues even today in Africa in a different form. Look at China. China has made massive investments across Africa. It's very influential in the region. But it has gained the influence only through money, power, and through coercion. It has forced countries, used its diplomatic influence and its economic strength to pressurize countries to give influence to China. Chinese companies, they own land, they have major industries here, they're executing key projects. As part of Belt and Road Initiative, China has gained a lot of influence here. It has built strategic ports in Kenya. In Kenya, you might have heard of a port called Mombasa Port. The Mombasa Port in Kenya. There are similar strategic ports in Tanzania and Mozambique. There are key projects in Malawi. All these key infrastructure projects are funded by China, built by China. US, Britain, and France, right? They have traditionally been very influential here. Even they have made a lot of investments, but their intention has never been to help the African people. They have not really focused on socio-economic welfare of Africa. They have blindly pursued African resources, which has been a selfish pursuit. Now, this is where India stands out. We will be discussing some of India's projects in Africa as part of this discussion, right? We'll talk about our ties with Mauritius. You will see how India has always pursued mutually beneficial ties with African countries. We have invested in several key projects. Like I said, our healthcare sector has become the backbone of Africa's healthcare today. Many African countries, including East African countries and these island nations, right? They all rely on Indian vaccines, Indian generic drugs, which are effective, safe, and cheaper. Is that clear? There are many Indian hospitals and diagnostic chains that have invested here. Popular hospital chains like Apollo, for example, Fortis, right? And many other hospital chains from India have a big presence here. Even in other key sectors like information technology, banking, mobile and internet, automobile. In all these key sectors, there are Indian companies playing a big role in Africa today. The big Indian IT firms from Infosys to Wipro have a major presence. Many Indian banks, ICICI, then SBI, right? They have a very big presence across this region. Bharti Airtel is involved in key telecom and internet projects across the region. When it comes to automobile sector, Indian companies have seen a remarkable success. Indian companies like TVS, Ashoka Leyland, and others, right? They have made big investments and they have succeeded in penetrating the African market. I'll tell you a very interesting story here. See, in Africa, there was a need for small trucks to carry goods, small vehicles, including two-wheelers and rickshaws to carry people and goods as well for powering transportation in African countries. Initially, Chinese companies made a huge impact. Chinese automobile manufacturers, they dominated the market. All right, because China produces on a mass scale, China pushed its exports and dominated the automobile sector, especially the smaller vehicles, the two-wheelers, small cars and trucks. Across the segment, China started dominating the African market. But as is the case with Chinese goods, they were not of a good quality. Even though China was selling them at a reasonable price, the quality was a concern. Vehicles would break down, cost of servicing was very high. So poor people in Africa, right, they could never afford the expensive repairs and servicing. So Chinese products were taking a hit. This is where Japanese automobile manufacturers entered. Right, Japan is known for superior quality, but they are very expensive. So even Japan failed to exploit this market. Right, you have top Japanese automobile companies, the leading firms from Toyota to all the big names. They tried to enter the market, but they faced challenges because the product was very expensive. Now, this is where Indian automobile manufacturers have made a difference in the last 15 to 20 years. You go to Tanzania or Kenya or Mozambique, you will see TVS bikes, Bajaj auto rickshaws, and the smaller goods carrying vehicles from Indian origin. They have penetrated the market because the vehicles are cheaper compared to the expensive Japanese vehicles, but it's of better quality compared to the cheap Chinese products. So this is where Indian automobile sector has made an impact in Africa. I'm just giving you one example, one case study, one business case study. Like this, in many sectors, India is making a difference. Indian companies, with the backing of the Indian government, they are making a difference in Africa, and we are building a mutually beneficial relationship. Even we have some big investments. For example, in the agriculture sector, India is playing a key role in food security for Africa and India as well. There are many Indian agricultural companies, food processing companies, that have bought land in Africa. They have taken it on lease, right? This is where we have competition with China. Chinese agro companies, they own thousands and thousands of hectares of land. They grow crops, right? And it helps in addressing the food security needs of Africa and China. So Indian companies are also competing here. There are many Indian agro firms. food processing companies that have big investments today, they are also leasing land to grow crops to increase productivity. Going forward, food security is a major concern because of climate change and extreme weather events. So these investments that we are making can help meet the food security needs of African countries, thus tackling hunger and poverty. And it could also help tackle food security needs of India. So that is the kind of mutually beneficial relationship that we have pursued with African countries. Today, our African diplomacy is a top priority. Even in the 1960s, 1950s, we supported the independence movement, the decolonization movement of several African countries. The Nehru government gave direct diplomatic support. Even Indian intelligence agencies were involved in providing direct support to the freedom movement across African nations. As we took a stand against colonialism and imperialism, we have backed the independence of several African nations in the 50s and 60s. We took a stand against apartheid, the racial discrimination in South Africa, where the whites were oppressing, targeting the black community, right? India took a principled stand, raised the issue at the United Nations as well, and supported the anti-apartheid struggle. We backed the African National Congress headed by Nelson Mandela. So that is the deep-rooted links we have with African nations. And today you can see that flourishing in the form of good ties with all the groupings and all the major countries across the region. This explains why India pushed for G20 membership to the African Union. This is the reason why I began this discussion, right? So that you get an insight into our African diplomacy. India has prioritized its ties with Africa, not just by keeping an eye on its resources, because we see a future here for mutual cooperation. There are 1.4 billion people in Africa, which equals our population, Indian population. We have many opportunities to collaborate as both of us are from the global south. We are all developing nations, underdeveloped countries. We have a similar mindset. This is what led India to push for G20 membership to African Union, and we succeeded in getting a seat for African Union at the G20. Right? You saw how African Union was admitted just a few days back. Right? So, with regard to these initiatives, Mauritius becomes very crucial for us. Given the priority we are placing on Indian Ocean and Africa, countries like Mauritius are critical for us. Countries like Comoros, Madagascar, Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, these countries are very, very important since we are very closely connected with them. We have close economic ties with them, close cultural ties with them. So this new beginning in African diplomacy started through the India-Africa Forum Summit. India-Africa Forum Summit that was launched by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. The renewed focus on Africa started a few years ago, right? In 2008, India brought African countries together by organizing this summit where we worked with African Union. It was a priority initiative of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and 3 summits have been held till date. 3 India-Africa Forum summits have been organized that has brought us closer to African Union and other regional groupings like SADC, COMESA, and ECOWAS. We're not just working with individual countries. We are working through such regional organizations. We have increased our investments across Africa. We are providing line of credit to several African countries. Indian companies are increasingly involved in the African market through their increased investments. Right? I mentioned the key sectors as well. We are directly playing a role in the socio-economic welfare of Africa today. We are helping them in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure creation, in improving connectivity, in introducing digital infrastructure. In all these areas, India has become a key partner of African nations. All right. So Three summits have been held. The India-Africa Forum Summit. Three summits have been held starting from 2008. Right? We held one more in 2011. There was one in 2015. These summits have really brought India closer to African Union and other regional groupings. We have opened new embassies and new consulates. Right? It shows our increasing diplomatic focus on Africa as a region. So we are pushing for a greater role for Africa in global affairs. This is what explains India's proposal to give G20 membership to African Union. You can expect a question here on these lines. That's why I'm discussing this topic. It's connected to Mauritius. Mauritius being an African Indian Ocean country, it can give us that push. It can act as a gateway, as a launch pad to promote and project our African diplomacy. Right? We are pushing for a greater role for Africa because Indian interests and African interests align together. That's why many African countries, they support UN reforms. They return the favor by backing India's entry into UN Security Council as a permanent member. We are pushing for greater representation for Africa as well at the UN, and African countries support us back by supporting our push for UN reforms. So it's in this context that you should look at India's relations with Mauritius. Now, I was telling you that 68% of the country's population, they are of Indian origin, they are of Indian descent. Now, how is this possible? What is the reason for such a large Indian community to be present? In such a faraway country, it's quite rare to find such a big Indian population. In fact, you find this in few other countries as well, like Fiji, then in the Caribbean, in South Africa, in Kenya, in a South American country known as Suriname. Across these countries, you find a strong Indian community. Fiji, I hope you know where it's located. It's in the South Pacific, next to Australia and New Zealand. In such a faraway island country, there is a strong Indian community. You can find influences of Hinduism, the Hindi language, Indian customs, Indian food being widely promoted and still being in use in Fiji. You see the same across Caribbean. Remember, in a class I told you, look at the West Indies cricket team. Look at the legendary cricket players, right? From Shivnarayan, Chandrapal to many others. They're all of Indian heritage. In Jamaica, in Barbados, right? Across Bahamas, St. Kitts and Nevis, across all these Caribbean islands, which are part of the West Indies, right? You find a strong Indian community. You find Indian traditions, Indian languages, Indian food and customs being very prevalent even today. The same is the case with South Africa, East Africa, and even Suriname, which is a South American country. The reason why we have such a big presence of Indian community across these faraway countries is because of the indentured labor system. When African slavery was abolished by the British Parliament in early 1800s, the British then needed cheap labor to continue their exploitation of the colonies around the world. So what they did, they replaced African slaves with Indian laborers. They brought out this exploitative bonded labor system called indentured labor system. They would sign these contracts with Indians, transport their entire families, and they would never allow them to return back. Initially, they would say contract is only for 5 years. You'll earn a lot of money, right? We'll give you good opportunities, good living conditions. Such fake promises would be made and contracts would be signed. But in reality, it was type of bonded labor, exploitative labor. They would dump them on these islands and faraway countries, and there was no way for them to come back. In 1800s, 1900s, how do you expect these Indians to come back? They could never come back. Once they would dump them here, they would force them to work in colonial mines, colonial farms, to look after their plantation crops, their factories. They wouldn't be paid salaries. They would not even be given proper living conditions and social conditions. Essentially, the Indian laborers were oppressed. They were exploited by the British. So those who remained, right, the subsequent generations, they form the close connection with India today. In a way, it has become an advantage today. India is able to easily project influence and exercise soft power influence across the world, primarily because of the indentured labor system. So Mauritius has been a part of the indentured labor system. It was a British colony, and one of the prime economic activity in Mauritius was sugar plantations. Sugar cultivation became a lucrative business for British companies. So when African slavery was abolished, when British companies they couldn't procure African slaves anymore, they brought Indian laborers, and Mauritius is the first country where the first batch of Indian indentured laborers were taken. It's a very important point from history, from international relations, which is relevant for your prelims as well. UPSC might ask a question here. To which country were the first batch of Indian laborers taken by the British? The answer is Mauritius in the year 1834. Just a few years after slavery had been abolished, they started this new system, this labor system, and the first batch of Indian laborers were brought here to this British colony, that is Mauritius. So thousands of Indian families from southern India, from parts of UP and Bihar, they were transported here and settled permanently. All right, to look after their sugar crops, sugar plantations. Even today, one of the biggest source of revenue for Mauritius is the sugar industry, apart from tourism and fisheries. Since it's an island country like Maldives, it has very limited sources of revenue. It does not have a well diversified economy. It is heavily dependent on tourism. Mauritius is a popular tourist destination, right? It has fisheries resources, that is a major source of revenue, but sugar industry remains a dominant sector in Mauritius. And it was Indian laborers who cultivated this sector. Even today, many of the sugar factories, sugar farms here, they are owned by Indians. The next generation of Indian community which has settled here, they own the sugar crops and the sugar plantations. India has been playing a critical role in supporting this limited economy of Mauritius. Right from independence, we built close ties with Mauritius. We gave them all the political diplomatic support. We gave financial support. We supplied all essential items, from food items to medicines, right? All essential commodities, even today, are sent from India. Because even Mauritius does not have major industries. So it has a lot of dependency on India, and we fulfill that dependency. We don't exploit that advantage. We don't force ourselves on Mauritius to make concessions. It's a very friendly, cordial, trust-based relationship because from several decades, we have been helping and protecting Mauritius. Mauritius has faced political problems in the past. When Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi were the prime ministers, right, in the 70s and 80s, even when Nehru was the prime minister in 60s, Mauritius had faced political problems. There was a lot of instability. There were attempts to overthrow the government. During all these crisis situations, Indian leaders stepped in. Indian leaders would intervene, negotiate with the Indian community. Indian intelligence agencies and Ministry of External Affairs would play a role to stabilize Mauritius internally. Since we had that connection and leverage, we would work with the Indian community and the political leaders and the parties to stabilize the country and to maintain democracy in Mauritius. So this is a historical role that we have played under various prime ministers. Our Ministry of External Affairs and our intelligence agencies have played a role in Mauritius in politically stabilizing the country. Right? We have supported their economy. So it all goes back to the presence of the strong Indian community. This is where the first batch of Indian laborers were brought in the year 1834. I've shared two images here, which is also important for your prelims. You can see this place called Apravasi Ghat. This place that you see here in these pictures, it's called the Apravasi Ghat. This is where the first batch of Indian laborers landed. Today, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Please note down this point. Port Louis is the capital, right? This is a major port here in the Indian Ocean. This is where the first batch of Indian laborers were brought. In 1834, when the first ship landed here, bringing the first batch of Indian workers under indentured labor system, they landed at this place. You can see this being depicted at the UNESCO World Heritage Site. It pays tribute to Indian indentured laborers. It highlights the horrors of colonial rule, the oppression, the human rights violations that the British committed, right? The conditions they kept Indian workers in is very well depicted here. It's a national monument in Mauritius even today. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site that pays tribute to indentured laborers from India. All right, so this place is called Apravasi Ghat, the place where the first ship carrying Indian laborers landed. And this day is celebrated even today as Apravasi Day. Apravasi refers to immigrants. It translates to immigrants. It's a Hindi Sanskrit word, right? The day on which they landed is celebrated even today. It's marked because that is the connection between India and Mauritius. That is what represents that cultural connection. So it is marked as Apravasi Day, and the place where they landed is called Apravasi Ghat, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There is a close connection between our freedom struggle as well, represented by Mahatma Gandhi and Gandhian principles. Gandhian principles gave inspiration to the freedom struggle of both India and Mauritius. I'm sure you would have studied in modern history how Mahatma Gandhi was very active in Africa, in South Africa and East Africa. Right? Mahatma Gandhi was very active fighting for the rights of Africans and as well as the Indian community. As a lawyer, as a young lawyer, before he came to India to lead our freedom struggle, Mahatma Gandhi was already leading efforts in Africa to fight for the rights of Africans and Indians. He had gained a lot of popularity in Southern and Eastern Africa. So he did visit Mauritius once. When he was traveling from India to South Africa, he had visited Mauritius, and the freedom struggle that took root here later against colonial rule was inspired by Gandhian philosophy and Gandhian ideals of ahimsa, that is non-violence, satyagraha, right? These principles were imbibed into Mauritius freedom movement as well. In fact, later, the Indian community here, they would invite Mahatma Gandhi to come and lead their freedom struggle. But Mahatma Gandhi could not provide leadership to Mauritius because by that time, he had come to India by 1915 to lead India's freedom struggle. So as Mahatma Gandhi was preoccupied in India's freedom struggle, he sent his closest disciple, Barrister Manilal Doctor, to provide leadership to the freedom struggle of Mauritius. This is another close connection. Manilal Doctor was a very close philosopher and a leader of the Gandhian movement. And he was a very close disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, who believed in Gandhian principles. So Mahatma Gandhi sent Manilal Doctor on his behalf to give leadership to Mauritius to lead the Indian community in their freedom struggle against colonial rule. That is the close connection that binds us together. Understood? So even today, Mauritius pays tribute to India's freedom struggle and Mahatma Gandhi by celebrating the 12th of March as the National Day of Mauritius. It's a national holiday in Mauritius. The 12th of March is celebrated every year as the National Day of the country. It is a tribute for India's freedom struggle. It's a tribute for Mahatma Gandhi, his principles, which inspired the freedom movement of Mauritius as well. All right? So please understand this deep-rooted cultural connection, this historical connection. This in itself could be a mains question, or let's say there is a question related to this. You can bring this angle, bring this historical perspective and show the insight into India-Mauritius relations and how it applies to our African diplomacy as well. Now, can someone tell me why 12th of March was specifically chosen by Mauritius? Is it any important day? Is there something important related to 12th March? Very good. Varsha, Kamalpal, Sridevi, Himanshu, they've all given the right answer. It was on this day that Mahatma Gandhi launched Dandi March, the Salt Satyagraha, which was a rebellion against the British salt taxation laws, right? So this is a key movement that Mahatma Gandhi led in India, the Dandi March. So to pay tribute to Mahatma Gandhi and to India's freedom struggle, this particular day has been chosen on the day when Dandi March was launched. So this is the National Day of Mauritius that pays tribute to India, to our freedom struggle and Mahatma Gandhi. All right. So I think such knowledge is very important in an exam like UPSC. We shouldn't just stick to textbook knowledge or what current affairs is giving us. We should go a little back in time, understand in depth the kind of close ties we have with these countries, because this is what creates the foundation for you. Now that you have this idea, tomorrow when you read newspaper articles, you can understand why we focus so much on Africa, why we focus on Mauritius. I'll tell you another important point. In 2014, when PM Modi came to power, remember I told you that he had a swearing in ceremony, a very grand swearing in ceremony, and where India launched the neighborhood first policy, right? The Modi government launched the neighborhood first policy to prioritize our ties with neighbors. And to send this message across to our neighbors, we had invited all the SAARC leaders. All the SAARC leaders had been invited. The leaders of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, even Pakistan, right? Nawaz Sharif was the prime minister at that point in 2014, right? The leaders of Bhutan and Nepal, Maldives, Afghanistan, all the South Asian leaders were invited. Basically, the SAARC member countries were invited. All the leaders participated as well. This was a symbolic way in which India announced the start of neighborhood first policy, where we prioritize our ties with neighboring countries. During this gathering, the only non-SAARC leader to be invited, the only non-SAARC leader who was invited by Prime Minister Modi was the leader of Mauritius. The then leader, Naveen Chandra Ramagulam, the then Prime Minister of Mauritius, he was the only non-SAARC leader invited to the swearing-in ceremony when we launched neighborhood first policy. Now, what does this signify? This is a symbolic gesture, a symbolic message being sent by India that even though Mauritius is not our neighbor, we treat Mauritius as our extended neighbor. Or else, why would we invite Mauritius while announcing neighborhood first policy? When only SAARC leaders with whom we share direct boundaries, only when they were invited, why invite just one non-SAARC leader? There was an intention, a purpose behind it. The purpose was to send this symbolic message to Mauritius that Mauritius is very close to India. Even though the country is far away from India, we treat Mauritius as a neighboring country of India, as though it's a neighbor of India. We give that extended neighbor treatment to Mauritius because of the deep-rooted cultural, historical links that we have with the country. All right? So now, let's understand how modern relations have developed and how strategic defense relations has become a priority. See, Mauritius has a very large exclusive economic zone. It is blessed with plenty of maritime resources. It has hydrocarbon reserves, fisheries, right? It is blessed with a lot of natural maritime resources, a very large EEZ which has to be patrolled and protected. It also deals with multiple security threats. There is organized crime, particularly drugs and arms trafficking, rampant in the region. Terrorism and piracy remains a major concern in these waters. This, of course, threatens Mauritius. It is also affected by disasters, from cyclones to oil spills. Mauritius has dealt with major disasters and it's not able to tackle them on its own. It's a small country with limited resources. So this is where India steps in. Just like we do with Maldives, we provide a lot of defense support, defense assistance to Mauritius to safeguard and protect the important sea lanes of communication, the important shipping lanes that exist here in and around Mauritius. They are infested by terrorists, smugglers, and criminals and pirates. This is a threat to India's trade as well, even to our energy imports in the region. It threatens stability in the Mozambique Channel. Shipping near East Africa and Horn of Africa is under threat because of the presence of these non state actors. So, promoting the defense and security of Mauritius is in the direct national interest of India. Our national security is tied to the security of Mauritius. So, from many decades, we have been providing a lot of military support to Mauritius. We have very, very close defense military relations. The Indian Navy is constantly deployed in the region. There is always a naval ship nearby. We have a few naval ships deployed here between Maldives, Mauritius, and Seychelles. It's like a triangular region between these three countries. So between them, there will be at least a couple of Indian naval ships nearby. And when required, we press them into service, we deploy them into the country. We provide them with training. Indian Armed Forces play a key role in training the defense forces and the Coast Guard of Mauritius. It's very similar to the arrangement we have with Maldives. We provide them with defense training. We train them in anti-piracy operations. We train them in counter-terror operations. Is that clear? Counter-terrorism, anti-piracy is a focus. We provide these training courses to them and we help in surveilling and patrolling their exclusive economic zone. Is that clear? So the Indian Navy and as well as Indian Air Force, they have been playing an important role in building the capacities of the Maldivian armed forces, the Mauritius armed forces. Many of their military officers, they train in Indian academies. Even their civil servants, their bureaucrats, diplomats, they train with our civil service probationers. So we have a very close arrangement between our governments and armed forces, and we also have very close intelligence sharing between the two countries. So this basically gives India a dominant presence in the region. Since we have our military assets deployed constantly, our naval ships and aircrafts are present here, it gives us a natural influence that helps us protect our interests. We have supplied defense technology. We have gifted key military assets to strengthen the defense of Mauritius. We have gifted the ALH Dhruv helicopter, the advanced light helicopter. Mauritius is part of the Coastal Surveillance Radar project, which we studied yesterday. We have gifted an offshore patrol vessel called Barracuda. OPV Barracuda is an Indian-built naval vessel which we have gifted to Mauritius. We have trained their special forces, the Marcos, the Marine Commandos of Indian Navy, which is a special force of the Indian Navy. They have given training to the defense personnel, to the Navy and Coast Guard of Mauritius in special operations. So this is what explains India's priority towards Mauritius. Given that we have so many big interests in the region, we have cultivated close security defense relations with the country. We have built the coastal surveillance radars, which was inaugurated by Prime Minister Modi when he visited the country in 2015. This is when the Sagar Doctrine was announced by the Prime Minister. After inaugurating the radar built by India, PM Modi announced the launch of Sagar Doctrine towards all Indian Ocean countries. So we have supplied helicopters, aircrafts. The Dornier reconnaissance aircrafts have been gifted. We have supplied naval vessels and given them training as well to step up their maritime security and coastal security. We have increased our economic engagement as well with investments. We have given fresh loans to Mauritius, and it is also part of the Colombo Security Conclave today. We have included Mauritius as a key member of the Colombo Security Conclave. The Trilateral Maritime Security Initiative we had with Sri Lanka and Maldives, right? This was elevated last year in 2022. by including Mauritius, and it's been renamed as the Colombo Security Conclave. We founded the IORA grouping, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. We founded this key organization along with Mauritius and South Africa. In fact, IORA is headquartered in Mauritius. Please note down this point, it's very important. The IORA regional grouping, led by India, founded by India with South Africa and Mauritius, it is headquartered in Mauritius at Port Louis. So IORA is crucial for our Indian Ocean diplomacy, right? And this organization is headquartered here in Mauritius. And since many years, we have been sending economic assistance and helping them in their defense procurement. Is that clear? Now, some of you might ask, what do we gain from all this? By donating military vessels, aircrafts, giving them training and economic assistance, what does India gain from all this? One advantage we have is to improve our ties with African countries and African groupings. As I told you, Mauritius is like a gateway, a launch pad, right? With Mauritius and its help, we have become closer to African Union, SADC, and COMESA, which are major economic groupings of the region. And thanks to the help of Mauritius and few other countries, we recently entered another grouping as an observer called Indian Ocean Commission, IOC. This is a new development which happened just a couple of years ago. All right. The Indian Ocean Commission is another important regional grouping. This is very important for your prelims. It also shows how we are countering Chinese influence and presence in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean Commission is a grouping that consists of 5 Indian Ocean island countries. They all represent the western part of Indian Ocean. In the western Indian Ocean, near East Africa, you have these 5 island countries. That is Madagascar, Comoros, Seychelles, Mauritius, and France. That's basically the French Reunion, La Réunion. So India has good relations with all of them. Now, recently, when African Union was added to G20, right? Who was the president of African Union? None other than the leader of Comoros. The president of Comoros is the current leader of African Union. Comoros holds the presidency of African Union. It explains why India gave this push to G20 to add Africa as a member through the African Union grouping. It explains our ties that we have with Comoros as well. We have similar good relations with Madagascar. We have very good ties with Seychelles and Mauritius. And of course, France is a very big strategic partner for India. So with the help of these countries, we joined this important grouping as an observer in 2020. In March 2020, India got admitted to this group as an observer state, which includes these 5 members: Comoros, Madagascar, Mauritius, Reunion, and Seychelles. These are the 5 members of Indian Ocean Commission. All right. This group already had important observers like China, Japan, Malta, European Union, United Nations, and the Organization of Francophonie countries. All the French-speaking nations, they have a grouping of their own called OIF, Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. It brings all the French colonies together, the former French colonies where the French language is still spoken, right? So France did have some colonies in this region. So the French-speaking nations have this organization called OIF, which is also an observer to the Indian Ocean Commission. So China already had a presence in this group. Japan had a presence. European Union had a presence along with UN, right? So now India's entry as an observer cements our influence and position as well. It gives us the opportunity to play a role in Western Indian Ocean and counter the Chinese influence, which has increased in this particular region. We couldn't have joined this group without the help of Mauritius and the other member countries. France gave a big push. Madagascar, Seychelles, and Reunion, right? Along with Comoros and Mauritius, they pushed India's entry as an observer, and we have joined this group as an observer. So this is why countries like Mauritius are crucial for our engagement in Africa and Western Indian Ocean. Of course, we have very close economic ties with the country. We have made a lot of investments. It's one of the largest trading partners for India in the region. All right. We do have a lot of exports that supports the country. We export petroleum commodities. Other essential items are exported from India. We have supported the sugar industry of Mauritius. So there's a lot of economic cooperation that goes on as well. But in the economic domain, there is one major concern for us. There is one major issue that we face. India has one major concern from Mauritius. This has to do with the flow of FDI into India from Mauritius. Mauritius is usually the largest source of foreign direct investment to India in most of the years, in the last 25, 30 years. Mauritius is at the top. Usually Mauritius is in the top 3. All right. It's on par with Singapore, United States, and other such advanced economies, which are the biggest source of FDI into the Indian market. Now, some of you might be perplexed. You might be wondering, how can such a small country with a limited economy, which is dependent on India, how can this country be the biggest source of FDI into our country? Many years, Mauritius has been at the top first position, overtaking Singapore, US, and European countries in terms of FDI flow into India. But generally, it's in the top 3 or in top 2 as well. Now, how is this possible? Right? This is something you should understand. Mauritius is a tax haven. It has declared itself as a low tax jurisdiction. It's a tax haven. But since it is a tax haven, this is misused by money laundering networks. Money laundering networks misuse tax havens like Mauritius and they push black money as FDI into our country. This has become a major economic and security concern for India. Here, the blame does not lie with Mauritius itself, but these criminal cartels and money laundering networks and agents who work around the world, they are misusing tax havens like Mauritius to divert black money into India. You'll understand more about this under internal security. In internal security, we have a separate chapter on money laundering. All right? Since it is connected with terrorism, drugs and arms trafficking and organized crime, money laundering is not just an economic threat, it's a national security threat. So in internal security, we have an entire chapter on money laundering. All right? To those who don't know what is money laundering, it is a process. It's an illegal process through which black money or illegal wealth, that is wealth generated through illegal sources, is converted into white money or legal wealth. I'm giving you a simple definition. The process of converting illegal wealth into legal wealth is called money laundering. Basically, your black money procured through criminal activities, extortion, corruption, tax evasion, right? That black money gets converted into white. The illegal wealth gets converted into legal wealth. This not only destabilizes our economy, but it is a national security threat because money laundering is connected with criminal cartels involved in drugs and arms trafficking. It is connected with terrorist outfits and it enables terror financing. Terror and insurgent groups, right? They play a role in money laundering along with the criminal cartels, and money laundering enables terror financing. That is why this is a major national security threat. So you'll understand more about this under internal security when I explain money laundering in detail. Right now, let's not get into the details. It's not necessary here. But just understand that since Mauritius is a tax haven, money launderers are misusing the country to divert black money into India. They set up something known as shell companies or shell corporations in these tax havens to get the benefit of low tax jurisdiction. All right, black money generated in India is taken out of the country. Complex transactions are conducted around the world to, to create a distance from the money and the actual owner of that wealth. So, after complex transactions, the black money becomes clean, it becomes white. It can't be connected with the illegal activity in India. Now, this wealth, which was laundered, which was cleaned, it is brought into a shell company here, set up in countries like Mauritius. These are fake companies, just a front. It's just acting as a front. It will not have any genuine business of its own. They are simply registered here to take the benefit of low tax jurisdiction. These shell companies or corporations, which are fraudulent front companies, they push the money back into our country as FDI. It comes back as legal wealth, legal investment into our country. All right. Right now, don't worry about the details. I'll explain all that under the money laundering chapter in internal security. But please understand that a tax haven like Mauritius gets misused through the process of money laundering. Black money is getting pushed into our country as FDI, and this remains a major concern. So we have been working with Mauritius to share tax information. We have signed a double taxation avoidance agreement to avoid double taxes being levied in both the jurisdictions. And these agreements provide for exchange of tax information. Tax-related information will be exchanged between the two sides so that our authorities like Enforcement Directorate, Financial Intelligence Unit, they can access the information to crack these money laundering cases. Is that clear? The concerned authorities dealing with money laundering happens to be Enforcement Directorate and also the Financial Intelligence Unit, India. So these law enforcement and intelligence agencies of India, they work with countries like Mauritius. We have signed few tax information exchange agreements through which we exchange our tax related information that helps in tracking these fraudulent transactions. All right, it helps in investigation, in pinpointing the culprits, and in bringing down these money laundering networks. So this remains a continuing fight. It's a global menace. It's not just India which is affected, it's a global crime that happens. There are many other institutions involved, many non-state actors involved in enabling money laundering. So such illegal transactions happen in almost every country, in almost every jurisdiction. So we are working with such countries, especially countries like Mauritius, which is a tax haven, to try and crack these cases involving money laundering and terror financing. Is that clear? So this remains a concern for us, and we want more cooperation with countries like Mauritius. We want their banks, their financial system, their institutions, governments to share more information with our authorities and help in our investigation. So this is what we are pursuing with Mauritius. We want greater collaboration with regard to sharing of financial intelligence. We have signed an agreement for this as well, to exchange financial intelligence and tax related information. So this is how India, Mauritius are tackling the concern we have in the economic domain. But other than that, it's a very friendly, cordial relationship. Apart from this one issue, right, the relations are very cordial between the two countries. We have given them several line of credits, that is concessional loans for development projects, infrastructure initiatives, for providing scholarships, training, and capacity building programs. We have also assisted them in hydrographic survey. Remember, I told you what is a hydrographic survey under India, Myanmar. So India has assisted Mauritius and even Maldives and Myanmar in conducting their hydrographic surveys. These are underwater surveys to map out the terrain of the sea floor. So by creating these hydrographic maps, it helps in deployment of naval ships and especially submarines. These surveys also help in resource mapping, in resource exploitation that is present on the sea floor. So India has the technology, we have that marine technology to map the sea floor through these hydrographic surveys. It basically uses sonar based technology. So we readily use the technology to help our friendly countries across Indian Ocean. We have worked with Sri Lanka as well, with Bangladesh, Myanmar. Recently, we transferred hydrographic maps to Maldives. We have assisted Mauritius as well in hydrographic mapping, right? So this is part of our cooperation with Indian Ocean countries. So like this, Mauritius has become a close partner for India. It's one of the vital components of the Sagar Doctrine that was launched by PM Modi when he visited the country in 2015. This visit of PM Modi was very important. It was during this visit the Coastal Surveillance Radar project was launched. It was inaugurated. The project launched under Manmohan Singh was completed, right? And PM Modi visited the country. He visited Seychelles as well following this to inaugurate the coastal surveillance radars that were built by India. They are integrated with our networks. We can track all the movement of ships and submarines and aircraft in the region. It is generating maritime intelligence. It helps us counter all the security threats, including the threat posed by the Chinese Navy. We also gifted OPV Barracuda during this visit. We are helping the country in the field of blue economy to implement the blue economy model to sustainably exploit the maritime resources. We are also focused on alternative systems of medicine, that is Ayush. Ayush medicines are very popular in Mauritius because of the strong Indian community. Ayurveda, yoga, Unani, Siddha, homeopathy, they are very popular in Mauritius. We promote Ayush as well as part of our soft power diplomacy. Remember how we got International Yoga Day designated through the United Nations, right? Similarly, we are promoting Ayurvedic medicines, homeopathy, Unani, Siddha. It's part of our diplomacy, cultural soft power diplomacy, to promote these traditional systems of medicine linked with Indian civilization and Indian heritage. So there are many focus areas where we are working with Mauritius. So during this visit of PM Modi, there were many big outcomes. We not only gifted naval vessels and launched the Sagar Doctrine and the Coastal Surveillance Radar project, but we also signed a key agreement to lease a strategic island from Mauritius. There is an island in Indian Ocean called Agalega Island. It belongs to Mauritius. It's located to the north of Mauritius. This island has been leased to India through this agreement that was signed in 2015. During Prime Minister Modi's visit, this historic agreement was signed with Mauritius, and a strategic island has been leased to India. And India is building transport connectivity infrastructure on the island. Transport connectivity projects are being taken up by India. These projects are entirely financed by India. It's being built by Indian companies. So basically, it means we are building a port. A harbor facility is being created along with a runway. So maritime and air connectivity is being provided to Agalega Islands. India, Mauritius have said this is just an economic project, commercial project. But the details of the agreement and the project are highly classified. The details are not available in the public domain. But reports indicate that these facilities could potentially become military bases for India. It has the potential to turn into a base for Indian Navy and the Indian Air Force if required. There have been satellite images that were recently released by Al Jazeera that shows advanced construction taking place at Agalega by Indian companies. An entire new runway has been built. Harbor facilities are being created along with warehousing facilities. So foreign strategic experts believe that even though it's a commercial economic project that will improve trade and economy, potentially it could become a docking ground, a, a foreign base where Indian naval ships and aircrafts can land to, to get support for refueling and resupplies. Just like China is building its own key projects, which potentially have a military value, right? Similarly, India also is taking up such initiatives with Mauritius by leasing the Agalega Islands. But this project has run into a lot of trouble. There have been large scale protests, and the project has been delayed as well. And we have reasons to believe that China might be behind these protests. Few opposition leaders have opposed the project. Even some local community members in Agalega, they've opposed foreign involvement, and they have led large scale protests on environmental grounds, saying these projects harm the coastal environment. They've also said foreign involvement will politicize Mauritius. It will drag Mauritius between India and China. So, on these grounds, opposition leaders and local communities have protested against the project, which has delayed the project as well. But Indian intelligence agencies have reasons to believe that China is sponsoring these protests to target the Indian project. Is that clear? So, this is a developing story. We don't know how things will proceed. So, please watch out for any developments related to Agalega Islands. It will come up in newspapers in the coming years. So, that is why our ties with Mauritius is so important. Is that clear? So, please look at the map. You can see where Agalega Islands are located. This is where Agalega Islands are present. All right. Now, moving on, the last 2 points. During this recent visit, a fresh line of credit of $500 million was announced for civilian projects. It is through these funds that we are building infrastructure at Agalega Islands. We have announced a concessional loan of $500 million for these infrastructure projects. PM Modi also inaugurated the World Hindi Center in Mauritius because Hindi language forms a cultural link between the Indian community here and India. Right? There's a strong linguistic connect through the Hindi language. Even Bhojpuri is very popular here. So World Hindi Center was set up as part of the cultural relations, and the ITEC program provides a lot of scholarships and training programs to Mauritius. In fact, it is available to many African countries. Many African countries get the benefit of ITEC, which helps in providing educational scholarships to African students, which allows African students to come to India to study in our colleges and universities. We sponsor many training programs, capacity building programs through ITEC funds. Got it? So this is another important initiative along with the focus on Ayush. The last point I want to make here is regarding a project known as the Pan-African E-Network project. This is another major initiative of India towards African countries. See, a few years ago, when APJ Abdul Kalam was the president of India, he was visiting many African countries as the Indian head of state. He was leading foreign visits, right? India was engaging closely with Africa under the Manmohan Singh government. So Abdul Kalam was on a visit, and he saw how African countries are poor, backward. They lack good education, good healthcare. So Abdul Kalam, he suggested that India can play a role in helping Africa's education and healthcare sector. He suggested that ISRO has required space assets, which is satellites, basically, communication satellites. Through our satellites, we can provide telemedicine, tele-education. Right? This was an idea that was proposed by then President APJ Abdul Kalam. He said, why don't we connect our colleges, our hospitals, our universities with African students and patients by using our satellite infrastructure? This idea was seriously taken up by the Ministry of External Affairs, and it launched this major initiative in 2009 called the Pan African E Network Project. We have implemented this under two phases, under phase 1 and phase 2. And through this project, we are providing telemedicine, that is e-Sanjeevani, and tele-education to multiple African countries. The entire infrastructure is from India. ISRO satellites are being used. We have laid OFC cables and the required satellite terminals. The receiving antennas have been set up across African countries under this project. The VSAT satellite terminals, which receive the satellite signals, right? Those antennas have been installed in multiple African countries. And we have laid OFC cables as well to connect the receiving stations with colleges, hospitals, etc. So African students and African patients can access quality education, quality healthcare in India through this project. African students can attend remote classes where Indian teachers, professors are teaching in various colleges and universities. They get quality education. They can consult with Indian doctors, with Indian hospitals. All right. In fact, medical tourism is a very big area of cooperation. Several families in Africa, especially the middle class and the upper class and the rich, those who can afford to travel to India, right? They don't have good quality healthcare in Africa, especially if they have to undergo complex surgeries, right? They don't have the facilities there. They don't have the doctors, the infrastructure needed. They can't afford to go to Europe or US, which is even more expensive. So their preferred medical destination is India. If you ever take a flight towards an African country, you will notice that half the flight will be filled with patients, right? Because they've all come to India for treatment, to get surgeries done, to get consultations, to get treated by Indian doctors, right? Indian healthcare sector has this huge advantage. Our healthcare is of great quality in the private sector at least, and it's affordable, it's cheaper compared to Western countries. So many African patients, thousands of them, come to India every year for medical tourism. So we have provided telemedicine services for consultation, where African patients can consult with Indian doctors remotely through Pan African E-Network project. This is another major initiative. This is how India has built mutually beneficial relations. See, we don't gain much from such projects, right? But we gain goodwill, we gain influence, we gain a positive push, which gives us that leverage in these countries for our military engagement, strategic engagement, and economic ties. So, Pan African E Network project is a major Indian initiative focused on multiple African countries. African Union is a partner, right? Mauritius and many other countries in southern, eastern Africa, central Africa, western and northern Africa. They're all part of this initiative, and we have completed this project as well. We built this under two phases, and today we are providing telemedicine, teleeducation services to African nations. So this explains why Mauritius is important and what are we doing in Africa to protect our interests, to counter China and protect our interests. I hope everything is clear. We've discussed all the required topics in sufficient detail. Now let us wrap up this topic by taking a quick look at Seychelles. Nothing much to discuss. It's all pretty much the same. But let's take a look. Let's go through some key points regarding India-Seychelles relations. It's very similar to Mauritius and Maldives. Right now, you know where Seychelles is located. We've already seen the map of the region. It's another Indian Ocean country, right? Located near East Africa in the Western Indian Ocean. And we do have a historical connect with Seychelles. Seychelles is very similar to Maldives. It's a group of islands, and its economy is heavily dependent on tourism and fisheries. It's a very small country with a very small population, all right, doesn't have a major economy as such, doesn't have any big industries, agriculture is limited. So its primary source of revenue today is tourism and fisheries. So historically, we have had a deep connect with Seychelles. It's quite close to India. It's very near to the Arabian Sea, to Lakshadweep Islands. So since colonial times, Indians have traveled and worked in Seychelles. They have settled in Seychelles in large numbers. You find that connection even today. In fact, what is interesting is that Seychelles has a population of around 1 lakh people, around 96,000 or 1 lakh. Imagine that. That is the population of Seychelles. In India, you'll find that population in one small neighborhood, in one locality. In one block in Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore, you'll have more than 1 lakh people. That is the population of this entire country. Out of this 1 lakh population, almost 11 or 12%, they are of Indian origin. Most of them are Gujarati traders. And you also have several workers from Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And this is not a new connection. It didn't happen in the last few years. This has existed from at least 150 to 200 years. Initially, the French had occupied this region. Later, it came under British rule. So ever since it became independent in 1976, we have established very close ties with Seychelles. Given its important location near Horn of Africa, Seychelles is crucial for our security interests and economic interests. Plus, we had this close cultural relationship where there were Indian families settled in Seychelles. Even today, you find several businesses here owned by traders and businessmen from Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Several businesses are run by Gujarati financiers and traders. So this is a very old connection dating back to 17, 1800s, 1900s. So this is what brings us closer, right? It binds us closer. And since independence, Seychelles has been dependent heavily on India. India is close by, so it relies on India for all basic supplies, from petroleum products, construction equipment, vehicles, IT infrastructure, internet infrastructure, right? Even food and medicines. Largely, they are sent from India. So India is a major trading partner. We have invested in this country as well. Many of the resorts here, right, which are very popular, some of them have Indian investments. Indian resorts, hotel chains have investments here in Seychelles. So this close cultural, economic connection is what makes Seychelles so important to us, right? It is again a entry point into East Africa. It's very close to Somalia. It's very close to Horn of Africa, which is a region of great interest for India because of piracy, because of terrorism. Even the Bab el Mandeb Strait is nearby. Mozambique Channel is also located nearby. So given these important locations and interests, Seychelles obviously becomes important for India, especially from a strategic point of view, right? Plus, we have deep-rooted economic, cultural ties as well. That always helps in building good relations with a country. So with main focus on defense and security, we have built extremely close ties with Seychelles as well. We have helped the defense forces of Seychelles to tackle piracy and terrorism and to protect the country's exclusive economic zone. Here as well, the Indian Navy plays a very important role along with Indian Air Force. We have gifted them military equipment. That's why I told you it's very similar to Maldives and Mauritius. We have gifted them fast interceptor boats, Dornier reconnaissance aircraft for maritime surveillance and coastal surveillance. We even have a military exercise called L'Amitié. We have a joint military exercise that is held regularly. It's called L'Amitié, and we help Seychelles in protecting its exclusive economic zone. Because this is a hub of piracy, right? The piracy terrorism present in this region, it can spill over towards Arabian Sea, and it could threaten Lakshadweep. It could threaten the coastline of Kerala. So that is why India is very concerned, interested in this region. If pirates extend their operations from here, the Somalian pirates, right? If they move towards the Lakshadweep waters, towards Arabian Sea and Kerala's coastline, it becomes a major threat for shipping through Indian waters. It will increase the cost of shipping. The cost of insurance will go up. So if cost of insurance and transportation increases, it will reflect in every commodity in the import prices. And this has a huge economic impact, right? That is why ties with Seychelles is extremely important. It's located in a key location near Horn of Africa and Somalia, and it plays a key role in helping India to tackle piracy, terrorism, and organized crime. That is the reason why we help the country in protecting its EEZ. Our naval ships and aircrafts are deployed. We have gifted surveillance aircraft and fast interceptor boats, and we have installed the coastal surveillance radar, which was inaugurated in 2015. Even Seychelles is part of the coastal surveillance radar project. So when PM Modi visited Mauritius in 2015, he visited Seychelles as well after that. He inaugurated the coastal radar that was built by India and launched the Sagar Doctrine. So Seychelles is an integral part of this initiative, and we also assist the country in disaster management. Seychelles and Mozambique, they are affected by cyclones in the region. This whole coastline here near East Africa is very vulnerable to cyclones. So we give them disaster management assistance. And even during COVID-19, when the pandemic broke out, we had conducted a mission called Mission Sagar, through which medical supplies were given to many countries in the Indian Ocean. Under Mission Sagar, Indian Navy deployed multiple ships. We supplied essential medical items like PPE kits, sanitizers, oxygen, and other such basic medical equipment and drugs were transported by India. We gifted them free of cost to Sri Lanka, to Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, East African countries, right? Even other neighbors of India, they all got assistance under this mission. When we came up with the vaccines, right? When we indigenously produced the vaccines, we launched Vaccine Maitri. That is our vaccine diplomacy, where we gifted free vaccines to these countries, and Seychelles was a big beneficiary. Seychelles had no ability to fight the pandemic on its own, because please understand, these are countries that are heavily dependent on tourism. All right, tourism is their lifeline. When lockdowns came in, when travel was restricted, all these economies came to a halt. Sri Lanka suffered, Maldives suffered, Mauritius, Seychelles, they took a massive economic hit. So at this critical point, India was the one which helped them out. We gave them all the basic supplies through Mission Sagar, later supplied free vaccines as well to quickly help the countries overcome the impact of the pandemic, so that they could reopen their economy, reopen the hotels and resorts, and bring tourists back, which is the driver of their economy. Is that clear? So this is the role we play. We've also given them $100 million as a loan through which they can procure other defense and security equipment from India. We have defense exports towards Seychelles. So we've given them a concessional loan of 100 million through which they can procure Indian military equipment. Then other minor points like ITC program for scholarships and training. In all key sectors, we help them out in training programs. Their banking sector, IT, their bureaucrats, police and military officials, they all train in Indian institutions, in Indian academies. All right, so civil service probationers, they will come across foreign probationary officers as well from all these countries. So they're bureaucrats, diplomats, police officers, military officers, they're all trained here in Indian academies and institutions. We have supplied basic equipment from cars to buses to computers. We have built their internet infrastructure. Medical devices have been supplied. right? The list goes on. We can give more examples, but this is enough. It gives you an idea as to how Seychelles is dependent on India and how we help these countries. We don't exploit their disadvantage, right? We don't seek to pressurize them like China does. We don't put them under a burden or push them into a debt trap. We always build a equitable, well-respected relationship, a mutually beneficial relationship. So during the Prime Minister's visit in 2015, we also focused on renewable energy cooperation because Seychelles is part of the International Solar Alliance. We have started helping the country in hydrographic mapping. We are helping the country in implementing the blue economy model. And more importantly, Seychelles also leased an island to India during this visit. It's called the Assumption Island. Just like Mauritius leased the Agalega Islands to India, during the same visit, Seychelles signed a secret agreement with India to lease Assumption Island, where India says it is going to build transport connectivity projects. So India is saying we are going to build a harbor and a runway. So basic maritime and air connectivity facilities will be created. We are saying that this will boost commercial activities. We are saying it's a commercial project designed to provide economic opportunities in the region. Is that clear? But again, the suspicion is that there is a strategic angle to these projects. If completed, they can potentially become military bases for India, given our close defense relations with these countries, right? And given that our naval ships, our helicopters and aircrafts are constantly present here, most likely Indian Navy and Indian Air Force will start using these facilities for logistics, operational logistics. That is to refuel our ships and aircraft, to resupply them. So this will increase their operational range. When you have such logistic facilities available far away from our country, our naval ships and aircrafts, their range can be extended, right? They can be easily deployed across Africa, in southern parts of Indian Ocean, right? This gives us a dominating presence to counter the Chinese influence in the region. But this project as well has run into a major problem. The proposed Indian projects at Assumption Island, see, this is where Assumption Island is located, all right? Assumption Island of Seychelles. There have been large-scale protests. There has been a lot of opposition in Seychelles as well, because of which the project has been delayed. The project has not started here. At least in Agalega, some construction has started, despite the protests and opposition. But in Seychelles, there has been a stronger opposition. And as a result, we have not been able to start the promised construction of these projects. So again, India's suspicion is that China might be sponsoring these protests. It might be using its influence to create opposition against the Indian projects because there is a clear strategic angle involved in these projects. So this again represents the constant competition between India and China across Indian Ocean. All right. So please note down that in 2015, when PM Modi visited these countries and launched the Sagar Doctrine, 2 islands were leased to India. Agalega Islands by Mauritius and Assumption Island by Seychelles. The agreements are still valid. We don't know the exact details because both are classified documents, secret documents, right? India is saying we are building transport connectivity projects for economic opportunities to promote trade. But experts believe that these can obviously become military bases for the Navy and Air Force, which will project our military influence. Problem is, on the ground, we are facing opposition. In Seychelles especially, right, this issue has been highly politicized. Opposition leaders have led mass protests against Indian involvement. In Mauritius as well, we have seen protests, even by local community members. So India's doubt is that Chinese intelligence agencies might be involved in triggering and sponsoring these protests to block the Indian projects. All right. So let's see what happens going forward, how it develops. So this is where you have to stay in touch with current affairs. Going forward, there will be some reports related to Agalega Islands and Assumption Islands. For now, please know where they are located, which country it belongs to. It could be very relevant for your prelims exam. There could be map-based questions in your prelims. Is that clear? So this completes my detailed discussion of Indian Ocean and East Africa. This is more than sufficient. We have covered all the key topics. Now it's all about tracking current affairs, tracking current developments, right? Now, if you have any questions, any doubts, let me know. I'll answer them. And after that, we'll take a break. We'll come back after the break and start with the next region, the next chapter altogether, to discuss Southeast Asia and East Asia. We'll focus on the Pacific region. All right, this is another important region as far as our foreign policy is concerned. So that is what we'll be taking up after the break. But first, let me look at all your questions, all your doubts. Ambesh is asking, is there a difference between extended neighbor and a neighbor, or is it the same? Of course, there is a difference. When we say a neighboring country, it means we share borders with them, land borders and maritime borders with them. So Bangladesh is a neighbor, Nepal is a neighbor, Sri Lanka is a neighbor. Extended neighbors are those countries that are located a little away, right? They're not your neighbors, you don't share boundaries with them, but they're a little far away from you. But because of the close relations you have, and since they are located right next to your neighborhood, you consider them as your extended neighbors. Like Southeast Asian countries, they are extended neighbors of India. Mauritius, Central Asia, we look at all these countries and regions as extended neighborhood of India, right? The countries and regions presented right next to our neighboring countries. That is our extended neighborhood. So there is a difference between the two. Prashant is asking, what are Indian listening stations? I think in the map that I had shared, you saw that in Madagascar and few other countries here, in Mauritius as well, it was depicted that there are Indian listening stations. So that is what Prashant is asking. What do they mean? These listening stations are basically communication facilities designed for espionage, for spying. It is used to intercept communication of target countries to generate intelligence. India has very close intelligence relations with most of these countries. So we have set up communication facilities in some of the countries to secretly spy on communication of target countries like China. All right. We intercept communications here as part of maritime security, maritime intelligence. So a listening station is a espionage facility designed for intelligence gathering, where it uses communication, it intercepts communication of others to pick up classified information. Santosh is asking a very good question. So recently, children in Africa died due to a medical syrup produced by an Indian pharma company. Will this affect our diplomacy with Africa? This is a very, very good question. I really was expecting someone to ask this question. It shows that Santosh is in touch with current affairs. Recently, there have been a couple of incidents in Africa. In a few countries, Indian cough syrup has led, apparently, that is the allegation. All right, it's not conclusively proven. There is an allegation that several children died because of consuming this syrup. It's a cough syrup produced by an Indian pharma company. WHO pointed fingers towards India. It said these deaths are directly linked with the cough syrup, where safety standards were not followed, and because of that, the children have died in Africa. India conducted its own investigation. We didn't get a direct link between the two. But definitely, the concern itself is enough to affect our relations with African countries. It will affect Africa's dependency on our pharmaceutical industry. Right? This is where India has to pull up its socks. We do have problems in regulating our drug industry. See, the big pharma companies, they do produce quality drugs. They do a lot of safety checks. They're very thorough in their quality check. Problem is, we have many small pharma companies. We have hundreds of small and medium-sized pharma companies which are not being regulated properly. We have a regulatory authority. We have few laws and regulations in place. Now focus should be on strict enforcement. Because in the medical industry, safety is of utmost importance. If you're producing unsafe drugs causing very bad side effects and even death, the two of children, and if there is a direct link established, right, that will destroy our export of drugs. No country will rely on Indian drugs going forward. So this is a serious concern. India is trying to address this. We have not neglected the issue. The moment the allegations came up from African countries and WHO, immediately India ordered investigations. We have stepped up the regulation of the pharma industry, and we are strictly enforcing the safety standards to ensure that we are producing safe drugs. Because our generic drugs are the backbone of the healthcare sector of multiple countries. This is a key component of our exports. It is a key component of our diplomacy as well with these countries. We cannot allow these incidents to affect our ties. So we have to gear up. We have to ensure that there are no mistakes on the Indian side. All right. India has taken those efforts already. We have put in place some measures to improve the safety and efficacy of Indian drugs. Next, Ambesh also has a good question. Sir, what will be the impact of military coup in various African countries on India-Africa relations? You might have read in newspapers that in the last 3-4 years, there have been multiple military coups and civil wars in Africa, right? In Sudan, in Niger, in Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, right? So there are many, many countries, Mali, Mauritania. So across this region in Central Africa and in Western Africa, especially in the African Sahel region, all right, African Sahel, it's a region from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea in the north part of Africa. It's located in the Sahara, Sub-Sahara region. Across this entire belt, there are many military dictatorships, many countries going through civil wars. There is also the threat of terrorism. Many countries are badly affected by terrorism. Groups aligned with Al Qaeda, Islamic State, they all have a major presence in some of these Sahel countries in Northern Africa, Northern and Western Africa. So these crisis situations definitely has an impact on India. Take the example of Sudan. A few months back, when civil war broke out in Sudan, right? Indians were trapped. There were many Indian workers, including members of Haki Piki tribe from Karnataka, right? So there are many Indian workers and traders who go to Africa for livelihood opportunities, for work opportunities. When they get trapped in these conditions, it becomes very difficult to rescue them. India launched an evacuation mission, right? We had to evacuate, pull out Indian nationals from Sudan through a very complex evacuation mission. This affects our investments as well. Our diplomatic focus will get affected. So definitely the military coups in Africa, the civil wars, the threat of terrorism remains a major concern, because we are paying more attention to North, West and Central Africa as well. But problem is these regions, the countries present here, like Niger, Chad, Ghana, then many others, right? Mali, Mauritania, Sudan, they're all very badly affected by coups and terrorism and civil wars. So stabilizing the region is also a priority. So there we don't have much of influence, but we can work with others. We can work with European countries, with West Asian powers and US to bring some stability to the region, right? Because instability in any form is bad for diplomacy. Syed is asking, is there a security threat in Mauritius? In Mauritius itself, we don't have any major security threat. Sakshi is asking, when we take an island on lease, what about the ownership of the people living there? See, this is part of the agreement, but we don't know the details of the agreement. According to reports, the local people will not be disturbed. Only some part of the island will be taken for these projects, and those who are getting displaced, they'll be rehabilitated. All right, that is a commitment that India, Mauritius, and Seychelles have made, but we don't know the details because it's a classified secret agreement. Femina is asking why ISRO has established a space tracking communication center in Mauritius, just like in Bangalore. See, obviously, to track our space launches, to track our rocket launches, launch vehicles, and the spacecrafts in orbit, we need a global network of tracking stations and command stations, right? So we not only have tracking stations in India, including a deep space network in Bangalore, and the master command center also is in Bangalore. But we have many tracking stations across the world. In Vietnam, we are setting up one station. There is one in Indonesia. There's one in Brunei. Similarly, we have a tracking station in Mauritius. And we are working with other partners as well to set up similar tracking stations around the world. They mainly help in tracking our launches from Sriharikota and later controlling the spacecraft, right? To monitor the trajectory, to receive the data, to fire the thrusters on board, to change the orbit. So in all the missions, be it Chandrayaan, be it Aditya L1, right, even other launches that we carry out, they should be constantly tracked, monitored. Signals have to be sent, data has to be received. So for that, you need a global network of tracking stations. So we work with friendly countries like Australia, European Space Agency, NASA. We use their space tracking stations as well, but we need our own network, and that is what India is creating. So ISRO has these tracking stations in Mauritius, in Indonesia as well, in Brunei. We are setting up one in Vietnam. We are also in discussion with Bhutan to set up a tracking station there. So it's part of our space cooperation. Abhijit is asking, is Sagar Doctrine equipped to tackle sabotages against our seabed assets like submarine cables, oil pipelines, etc., due to increased Chinese presence? Of course, we deal with any threat to our assets because in the maritime area, we have many underwater assets. I don't know if you know this, most of the internet is underwater. Many have a wrong assumption that internet largely comes from satellites. That's not true. But most of the internet that we have built right now, right, passes under seas and oceans. There are submarine cables connecting continents and countries. Is that clear? So this is a key asset. It's a critical infrastructure. So these submarine cables could be threatened, maybe by a hostile country, right? They might tap the cables to carry out cyber espionage, to spy on our internet traffic, or they might destroy the infrastructure to harm our cyberspace. So this is a major threat. Similarly, we have pipelines, oil and gas pipelines that pass underwater. All these are maritime assets, national assets. So as part of security, maritime security, under Sagar Doctrine, of all these underwater assets as well. That includes submarine cables, then any oil gas pipelines, and even offshore facilities like oil rigs. Then you have offshore wind turbines. All these are national assets. So protecting them falls under Sagar Doctrine. Last question from Vaishna. Why is the next century said to be the African century? For obvious reasons. Africa is the largest continent, right? With a population of 1.4 billion people, there are great opportunities in Africa. It has plenty of natural resources, from gold to diamond to rare earth elements to uranium, hydrocarbons, oil and gas, right? Plus forest resources, plus land. So Africa is it's a continent, a region with full of natural resources yet to be exploited. So obviously, countries are interested in Africa. Previously, it was an exploitative relationship, but now with the growth and rise of Africa as a regional power, and with support of countries like India, Africa is all set to witness the next stage in its growth. Right now, it faces many problems, like I said, from poverty to lack of education, lack of healthcare, etc. But these problems can be tackled with better growth, better opportunities. And that is what India is trying to create, right? The current security conditions can also be tackled. The coups, the terrorism, the civil wars that you see can also be brought under control with more economic growth and economic opportunities. So that's why experts believe that in the coming decades, Africa will grow, it will rise, going forward. And you might very well see Africa dominating the next half of the century, right? Along with Asian powers like India and China. All right. So, guys, these were the questions. Now, let's take a short break. Let's take a 10 minutes break because we have spent a lot of time in answering questions. It's almost 6:55. Let's come back at 7:05. All right. And we'll start with the next chapter. I'll see you back at 7:05. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the session. Now, let's start with another important region, that is Southeast Asia and East Asia and the larger Pacific region. This region has become an increasing priority for India because it's part of the Indo Pacific. I've been explaining in previous classes as well that Southeast Asia lies at the very heart of Indo Pacific, it's at the very center of Indo Pacific. Historically, we have been very close to Southeast Asia and East Asia. Throughout our discussions, we have been mentioning how we have had close religious, civilizational, cultural connections with these two regions. Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, they have been a common connect that has bound India with Southeast Asian region and the East Asia region as well. So to prioritize this region in our foreign policy, we have a dedicated foreign policy doctrine called the Look East policy that was launched in 1991. The then PV Narasimha Rao government was dealing with a very difficult global environment. So at this crucial juncture, the Look East policy of India was launched to pay more attention to the east of India, to build better ties, closer relations with Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries. Under the Look East policy, many big initiatives were taken up. Look East was a big success for India, but there were some shortcomings. There were some areas where we could have done better. So to address the shortcomings and to pay even more attention to Southeast Asia and East Asia, this policy has been upgraded in 2014 by Prime Minister Modi. Today it's called the Act East policy of India. So in many ways, both the policies are not very different. They are pretty much the same, but the policy has been restructured. Some areas have been prioritized. There is greater focus on some initiatives. So we can say that Act East policy is an improved version of Look East policy. Look East and Act East are not very different. The focus area, the priority areas are pretty much the same. The approach is also pretty much the same. But through some changes, we are addressing the shortcomings of Look East. We are trying to overcome the hurdles we faced in Look East. And that is why Act East policy is an upgraded version. It's an improved version of Look East policy. This is a very important analysis, a very important assessment that you have to understand. Now, let me explain, why did we launch the Look East policy? How did it evolve? What was the rationale behind launching the Look East policy? Why did it become necessary in 1991? Right? What were the difficult circumstances that India was facing in this period? We should understand which countries are the focus under Look East Act East policy of India. We should talk about the overall approach of India, the big achievements we have made under this initiative, understand the differences between Look East and Act East, and pick up some important countries and study the relations with those countries. So as part of this discussion, I will be picking up Japan, Vietnam, and Australia. These are the three important countries in the region. First, we'll understand the overall approach towards the region. We'll have a broad discussion on Southeast and East Asia. We'll understand what India has done under Look East Act East policy, and then discuss these countries one by one. We will also be covering many important regional groupings and organizations as part of this discussion. We will study about ASEAN, East Asia Summit, Mekong Ganga Cooperation. Then we'll also discuss something known as ADMM Plus. All these are important regional groupings and initiatives which is relevant for India. So we will cover all these topics as part of this holistic discussion on Southeast and East Asia. So under the Look East Act East policy, our focus is mainly on ASEAN group. ASEAN is a regional organization that represents 10 Southeast Asian countries. ASEAN stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Just like we have European Union, SAARC, similarly there is ASEAN. The 10 Southeast Asian countries, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. These 10 Southeast Asian countries have formed this group called ASEAN, which was established in 1967. Since then, these Southeast Asian countries, they are cooperating with each other. They have created a free trade area to allow for free movement of goods, services, and investments between them. Just like European Union, they have created a common market. They have relaxed the visa, immigration, border controls to allow the free movement of people. So ASEAN has been instrumental in building Southeast Asia as a major economic bloc. It is seen as one of the most successful groupings in the world after European Union. It has succeeded in the last 60 years in bringing these 10 countries together to create a strong economic union, and they also share very good strategic ties with each other. They focus on various issues, including security, climate change, connectivity, tourism, investments, right? All these are focus areas for ASEAN grouping. And India works closely with the ASEAN. Last year, a new member has been added. There's a small country called Timor-Leste. It is located near Australia, to the north of Australia, next to Papua New Guinea. So this country, Timor-Leste, also has been added. It is all set to become the 11th ASEAN member. It is yet to complete the joining process. That will take some time. So maybe by next year, Timor-Leste will become a full-time member. Thus, ASEAN will have 11 member countries. But as of now, officially, there are only 10 countries, and the membership of Timor-Leste has been just approved. All right. So in our Look East, Act East policy, our primary focus is on this group, the ASEAN group. The primary focus is on Southeast Asia. Along with this region, we also focus on East Asia and the Pacific region, where we are prioritizing our ties with Japan, South Korea, and we are even seeing Australia and New Zealand and Papua New Guinea. And the Pacific Island countries as an extension of this policy. In the last few years, there is a lot of focus on Pacific Island countries like Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu, Palau. There are many small island countries in the South Pacific next to Australia and New Zealand. So these countries, this region has become a focus because there is a increased military diplomatic presence of China. China is competing with traditional powers like Australia, New Zealand, and of course the United States. So there is a big competition, a great game going on in South Pacific. So we are focusing on these countries as well as an extension of the Act East policy. So Japan and South Korea are also a focus, along with focus on Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific Island countries. So this is the broad policy approach of India to improve our ties with this entire region in the Indo-Pacific. So we do share very good cultural, historical ties with this region. We are focused on improving our economic relations. We are also focusing on improving our strategic defense and military relations as well. These are the key pillars of Look East, Act East policy. Building close economic ties, promoting the strategic defense military relations, and reviving our cultural historical relations. Is that clear? Please look at the map. You'll understand which are the focus regions and countries. This is Southeast Asia, covering the 10 ASEAN member countries. And don't forget, Myanmar is a neighbor of India. Remember what I had explained under India Myanmar? Myanmar is like a bridge. It's a land bridge connecting our northeast region directly with Southeast Asian countries. So we share direct land boundaries and maritime boundaries with this Southeast Asian country. Even Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, they're very closely located to India. We even share maritime borders with some of them through the Andaman Nicobar Islands. Our exclusive economic zone borders the EEZ of some of these Southeast Asian countries. So since centuries, there has been a connection between the Indian civilization and the Southeast Asia region, right? We have discussed how Cholas were influential across the region. We have discussed the presence of Tamil community in Myanmar. We have discussed key projects that we are pursuing, which involves Myanmar, Thailand, and few other countries in the region. We have close defense strategic relations with many of them today, right? We are extending this focus to East Asia as well to improve our ties with Japan, South Korea, and also the Russian Far East. That is the Siberia region of Russia, which is closer to the Arctic Circle. Even in the North Pacific, towards the Arctic, there is a new competition which has opened up because of a new shipping route. The Northern Sea route has opened up in the Arctic because of melting ice caps and glaciers. Right? Due to global warming, the polar ice caps are melting, creating new shipping channels. So this northern shipping route is of great geopolitical significance. There are plenty of resources in the Arctic. The shipping route itself is of great significance for global economy, and all the big powers are competing here, from US to China to Russia, Japan, and other European powers, right? Canada, they're all competing in the Arctic Circle. So we are focusing on Russian Far East and Siberia region to improve our presence and influence in the Arctic, to play a role in the northern shipping route, in the northern sea route. We are extending this influence to South Pacific with the help of friendly countries like Australia and New Zealand to focus on Pacific Island countries, the small Pacific Island nations that are present in the South Pacific. Right? Now let's talk about why this policy became necessary. Why didn't we have this policy before 1991? What happened in 1991 that pushed Narasimha Rao government to launch this policy? That is something we should understand. See, during the Cold War period, from 1945 to 1991, Southeast Asia was largely divided. Even East Asia was divided. India itself had different positions during the Cold War. Remember, we have studied this as well. Initially, we championed the non-aligned movement. India founded the non-aligned movement, championed this movement with other neutral countries such as Indonesia. So at least until 1971, until the liberation of Bangladesh, India was firmly committed to the non-aligned movement. We weren't aligned either with the US and the Western power bloc, and nor did we align with the Soviet Eastern bloc. We had maintained our neutrality, we remained non-aligned, and Indonesia was a key partner. But other countries, they had chosen their partners. They had allied with some Western countries or with Soviet power bloc. For example, Singapore, then to an extent Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. These countries have usually aligned with US and Western countries, even during the Cold War. Other countries like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, right, Vietnam, they were all communist states aligned with China and Soviet Union. So during the Cold War, Southeast Asia was divided on ideological lines. Some of the countries were aligned with the communist bloc, some were aligned with the Western countries, some were neutral like India. Indonesia, for example, was one of the founding leaders of the NAM movement. Japan and South Korea, obviously, they've always been Western allies. Since the end of the Cold War, Japan obviously aligned with the US after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After imperial fascist Japan was defeated, Japan obviously was brought under Western influence and it became a Western ally. South Korea also aligned with US and Western powers following the Korean War, which divided the Korean peninsula into North Korea and South Korea. So as North Korea aligned with communist China and Soviet Union, South Korea aligned with the Western democracies. So across the region, the divisions were very evident. Australia and New Zealand have always been Western allies. So because of these ideological divisions, India couldn't focus on our diplomacy. We couldn't build close relations with most of the countries. You all know what happened after 1971. India abandoned non-alignment because of the American threat, and we chose to side with the Soviet power bloc. Right? The US supported Pakistan in the 71 war, threatened India as well, and it became hostile to India after this. US started targeting our nuclear and space program. So we were forced to give up non-alignment and we chose to take the support of Soviet Union. Soviet Union became a strategic and a close military defense partner for India. So as we switched towards the Soviet Union, again, it was difficult for India to maintain good relations with Southeast Asian, East Asian and Pacific powers. So until 1991, the situation was not ideal to build good relations with all of them. There were a lot of complications. And India had focused more on its immediate neighborhood because we were preoccupied in our neighborhood itself. Our neighbors were causing so many problems, right? That we were preoccupied. All our diplomatic energy, our military resources were aligned towards our neighboring countries. We had problems with Nepal, issues with China and Pakistan, problems with Sri Lanka, problems with Bangladesh. So throughout this period of 40 odd years, we were preoccupied in our neighborhood itself, focused only on South Asia and focused on big powers such as US, European powers and Soviet Union. This is where our focus lied during the Cold War period. And also understand, our diplomatic resources were limited. Our military resources were limited, right? We were a very poor country with a lot of developmental issues and problems. And we had major geopolitical problems, including border disputes, wars, terrorism, internal differences, problems with all the neighboring countries. So during this difficult period, we never got an opportunity to focus on other countries and other regions. In fact, not just Southeast and East Asia, we even couldn't pay attention to Africa and Latin America. We couldn't build ties with Israel. Officially, we could not set up ties with Israel as well because of problems in West Asia. We'll understand that in the next chapter. So until 1991, we never got the right opportunity to work with other countries, to focus on other regions. We were preoccupied with our neighbors and big powers like US, European countries, and Soviet Union. But in 1991, something changed. There was a very big dramatic change that happened in 1991. What were the changes? the Cold War came to an abrupt end. The world order completely changed with the collapse of Soviet Union and with the disintegration of communism. Communism weakened and declined, correct? From 1989 itself, the Berlin Wall was brought down. This led to the reunification of Germany, which you will study in world history. As communism was on the decline in Central and Eastern Europe, many communist states like East Germany, then Poland, right, and others, they were all moving away from communism. So Germany reunified by bringing down the Berlin Wall, which marked the end of communism, the start of the end of communism. It marked the beginning of the end of communism and Soviet Union. Within 2 years, there was a major decline in communism, and finally USSR itself collapsed and disintegrated, forming multiple new countries across the Eurasia region. Right? All the new East European countries were created, like Ukraine, Belarus, and your Baltic countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. All these countries were born in Eastern Europe, which were previously part of Soviet Union. Then in Central Asia, all the new Central Asian countries were born. Even in Eurasia, right? Countries like Georgia, then Azerbaijan, Armenia, they were all born out of Soviet Union itself. So basically, the world order changed. Until then, it was a bipolar world where we had two poles, two power centers, right? One was represented by US and West European democracies. The other pole was the Soviet Communist Eastern Bloc. This bipolar world ended in 1991, and we shifted towards a unipolar world dominated by US and West European countries. Basically, global geopolitics had changed overnight. The disintegration of Soviet Union was a huge loss for India because India lost a strategic partner. Before this, Soviet Union had been the biggest supporter for India. It gave us diplomatic support at United Nations on all major issues, including the Kashmir dispute. Soviet Union played a critical role in modernizing India's armed forces. It became the primary arms supplier to India, from naval ships to submarines to fighter jets to missiles to artillery guns, battle tanks, right? They were all supplied by Soviet Union. It became a strategic partner even in the nuclear and space domain when US and Western countries were trying to target our nuclear and space program. So we had relied heavily on Soviet Union. Soviet Union was the only reliable, trusted partner India had at the global level. So by losing such a close friend, all of a sudden we realized we were running out of friends. The successor state, Russia, was initially struggling. We couldn't just rely on Russia's support going forward. So Prime Minister Narasimha Rao realized that this was a strategic opportunity. It's not a hurdle, it's not a challenge. Rather, it's an opportunity being created. Now that we have lost our closest friend, right, our reliable partner is gone. We can't rely on Russia alone. The time had come for India to diversify its foreign policy. The time had come to look for new partners while protecting the old relations. It's not that we were ignoring Russia. We will continue to be a good friend of Russia and all the other former Soviet republics, but we needed new partners and new friends. Because it was not just the external geopolitical problem. Internally, we faced a major problem in our economy. In Indian economy, you would have studied about the BOP crisis, the balance of payments crisis. Because of red tapeism, the license Raj restrictions, the import restrictions, right? Our economy had collapsed. We were running out of forex reserves and we didn't have enough reserves left to continue imports. This is called the BOP crisis, the balance of payments crisis, very similar to what Sri Lanka faced recently. So, at this crucial point, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, along with his Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, they opened up the Indian economy. We kept aside the socialist era principles and introduced LPG reforms. We liberalized our economy, removed all the strict restrictions and regulations, privatized some of the key sectors and public sector units, and globalized our economy. We opened up for more foreign trade. We freed up production, exports, and imports were all liberalized. So, India right now needed new markets where we can export our goods and commodities. We needed new investments. We had to bring in foreign capital and foreign expertise and technical knowledge to drive India's economic growth. So this meant we needed new friends as well. We needed new destinations where we can export our agricultural produce, our industrial commodities. We needed new investments. Foreign capital became necessary. Technology became necessary. We also needed resources that we didn't have. We had to find essential resources to protect our imports, to maintain our energy security, and to drive our economic growth. So this was a challenging period for India. Internally, we were dealing with a massive economic challenge, and externally, we were dealing with a geopolitical challenge. It was at this juncture that Narasimha Rao launched the Look East policy of India. We diversified our foreign policy and started focusing on the regions that had not been given attention. We finally established official ties with Israel in 1992. We started paying more attention to Africa and Latin America. And we started focusing on Southeast Asia and East Asia through the Look East policy. The time had come for India to find new partners and friends as well, because we needed new markets, new investments, and we needed global diplomatic support on key issues, be it trade negotiations, climate change negotiations that were beginning, even with regard to United Nations and border disputes of India like Kashmir dispute. On all these issues, we needed new friends to support our stand. We needed new partners. So that is why our foreign policy was diversified as well. It was under this initiative that Look East policy was launched to pay special attention to the east of India, that is Southeast Asia and East Asia. Is that clear? So please understand the evolution of this policy, the rationale behind launching this policy. So under the Look East policy, we opened fresh relations, gave more attention to ASEAN grouping and Southeast Asian countries. We also started focusing on East Asian countries. The priority was building economic, cultural, and strategic relations. Please remember the priority in the same order. Under Look East policy, the first priority was to build closer economic and commercial ties. This was the first focus. Second was to increase our strategic security ties with these countries. And third was to revive our historical civilizational connect. So with these priorities in focus, we launched the Look East policy that brought India closer to this important region towards the east of India. Is that clear? Now, let us look at the key contours, the key approach and initiatives under Look East policy. Because later I'll compare this with Act East policy, and you will see that they're not very different. There are some differences, yes, but it's more of an improvement. It's more of an upgraded version. It's like you install a new software update, right? Doesn't mean that the application or the operating system is completely new, right? It's an improvement on the previous older version. So let's study the contours of Look East policy. What areas were prioritized from 1991 to 2014? Once we understand this, I'll compare it with Act East policy. We will look at the contours of Act East, and you'll see how Act East is an improvement on Look East policy. All right, so let's do that, and then we can start with the important countries from the region. One of the priorities under Look East with regard to improving economic ties, strategic ties, and cultural ties was to bring the Northeast region closer to Southeast Asia. This was one of the top priorities. Because please understand that for many decades, Northeast region had been neglected because of its remoteness, because of the lack of connectivity. India hadn't paid much attention to the development of Northeast India. The region had been consumed by multiple insurgencies. From 1947, Northeast India has been affected by insurgencies. You'll study this in detail under internal security, where we have a chapter on Northeast insurgency. Northeast of India was affected by Naga insurgency, then insurgency in Assam, in Tripura, in Manipur and Mizoram, right? So across the region, multiple insurgent movements had started, creating destabilization of the region. There were foreign countries involved that were supporting the insurgent movements. There was Pakistan, there was China. These insurgents had a support base in Bangladesh and in Myanmar. So there was a security problem, a political problem, along with poor economic development. We hadn't created adequate infrastructure. Economic opportunities weren't present. The required infrastructure was not created. Roads and railway lines were missing. Power was missing. So India started focusing on the Northeast region from 1990s onwards. We paid fresh attention, and we realized that by connecting Northeast India with Southeast Asia, by using Myanmar as a connect, as a link, we can bring better development to the Northeast region. We can connect Southeast Asian markets with Northeast markets. The products from Northeast India can be exported directly to Southeast Asian countries. We can attract investments from here and bring investments into Northeast sector, right? And with development, with infrastructure, with growth, you can counter radicalism and extremism as well. One way to tackle insurgency and terrorism is to bring better growth and development to the affected region. So with this focus in mind, one priority under Look East was to connect Northeast with Southeast Asia by using Myanmar. This remained a top focus, and even today, it is a top priority. Is that clear? So please understand this connect. Because Southeast Asian countries, they have done remarkably well with regard to their economic development. If you look at them individually, they might look like very small countries with small economies compared to India. Right? They have a small population. The size of the countries are very small. Look at how small Singapore is. Right? It's a city-state, smaller than most of Indian cities. Look at how small Brunei and all the other Southeast Asian countries are. Right? Their territory is small. The resources they have is very limited. Population is also very small. But still, they are major economies. Each of the country has a unique strength. And when they come together as ASEAN group, they become a formidable economic strategic force. Individually, they might be small, right? But collectively, as ASEAN group, they become a formidable geopolitical grouping. You look at Singapore, it's a financial hub, a hub of innovation, a global financial hub which can drive investments into India. Singapore has been one of the biggest sources of FDI into India, right? Singapore is a leader in the services industry, be it IT, legal services, financial services. So there's a lot of things we can learn from Singapore and we can gain from Singapore. Look at Thailand, look at Indonesia, right? They're very strong in agriculture. Like, for example, in the coconut industry, Thailand, Indonesia are market leaders with regard to palm oil exports. Thailand and Indonesia, again, even Malaysia, they are right at the forefront, right? Even fisheries, food processing industries, then few manufacturing sectors as well, like automobiles, electronics. All these countries have their own inherent strength. You look at Vietnam. Vietnam is a communist country even today, but still it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It has become a startup hub like India. Vietnam is a IT hub, a startup hub, where a lot of innovation is taking place, a lot of research is taking place in Vietnam. So every country has its own unique strength, and collectively they become a formidable economic force and a major geopolitical grouping. So there are a lot of things India can gain from these countries. We can export a lot of commodities to these countries. We can export agricultural products, industrial products, raw materials. We can procure a lot of components from Southeast Asia. We can bring investments from there. So there's a lot for India to gain. And one focus was to connect Northeast region closely with Southeast Asian markets. Next, building these close economic trade relations by pursuing free trade agreements. We started negotiating FTAs. Now that we had opened up our economy, right? We had liberalized, privatized, and globalized. We pursued free trade agreements, and India has signed FTAs with Malaysia, with Japan, and we even signed an FTA with the entire ASEAN group. This was one of the biggest success of Look East policy. Especially in the economic domain, in the trade sector, we did achieve a lot of progress in 20 odd years. From 91 to 2014, we signed 3 major FTAs. They are known as SECA or SEPA. These are the names that are used. It stands for Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement or Partnership Agreement. All right? They're nothing but FTAs, free trade agreements. Through these agreements, you reduce barriers to trade. You reduce the barriers to trade. You tackle the tariff barriers. If there are high taxes, import duties, you reduce them, you bring them almost down to zero, so that there is free movement of goods, services, and investments. All right? You tackle the non-tariff barriers as well. You improve connectivity. You relax the visa immigration norms. You provide for more support for tourism, right? So that you build people-to-people relations, cultural relations. So more people can travel between the two sides, thus enabling entrepreneurs, investors, traders, workers to freely mingle and drive the economy of both the sides. So that is what is done in any FTA. The primary purpose of a free trade agreement is to promote free movement of goods, services, investments, and as well as people. And how do you do that? You do that by reducing the barriers to trade. There will be several barriers to trade. Some are tariff related, tax related. There will be high import duties, custom duties. You reduce them, bring them almost down to zero, provide duty-free access, right? That will drive the movement of goods between the two sides. It will increase exports on both the sides. You reduce the non-tariff barriers, all the non-taxation barriers, like lack of connectivity, lack of infrastructure, policy support, then visa immigration norms. When you tackle the non-tariff barriers, automatically it will drive faster movement of goods, faster movement of services. It will attract more capital, right? It will allow more people to travel between the two sides, which drives all the economic activities. So we succeeded in signing 3 FTAs, either known as SECA or SEPA, We signed one with Malaysia, one with Japan, and later one with the entire ASEAN group itself. Another feature of Look East was that we increased regular engagement at the highest level between the two sides. Meaning at the highest level of the government and the leadership, at the level of Prime Minister, President, Vice President, Cabinet Ministers, senior government officials, they would regularly meet and interact with their counterparts from the ASEAN region and East Asia region. All right, frequent visits would be organized, regular meetings, structured dialogues. So we discuss, initiate a proposal and take that forward to ensure its implementation. So regular, proactive, high-level engagement became a feature of Look East policy. So Indian prime ministers would frequently visit Southeast Asian countries. Top Indian ministers, officials, they would visit multiple times. Similarly, ASEAN leaders and ASEAN officials would be invited to India. So regular engagement at the highest level drives close relations. This was a feature of Look East policy. We tried to build close defense and security ties as well, with focus on maritime security. Because if you look at Indo-Pacific, right, especially Southeast Asia, it has a preeminent maritime character to it. Southeast Asia is bound by Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, South China Sea, etc. So maritime trade is a key pillar of the economic growth of this region. And there are many security threats to maritime trade. You have organized crime, there is terrorism, radicalism, even piracy in some places. So tackling these threats was a common concern. There were maritime disputes, tensions between some countries. So naturally, India sought close defense security ties as part of the strategic partnership with focus on maritime security. And finally, we tried to revive our historical cultural links. Understood? We promoted Buddhist diplomacy, the Buddhist Circuit Initiative, the project to revive Nalanda University, which was a historical place of learning, right? Where students from across Southeast and East Asia would come to India in historical times to engage in Buddhist studies and other cultural and scientific studies. So reviving Nalanda is part of this project, right? Then apart from Buddhist Circuit and Nalanda University revival, we have also focused on building restoring some pilgrim sites, some historic temples, such as the Angkor Wat temple and other temples present in Cambodia. Cambodia has a deep-rooted Hindu-Buddhist connection with India. If you guys have ever visited Cambodia, or even if you visit Vietnam and Laos and Myanmar, right, across this region, you see a strong connect with Hinduism and Buddhism, right? Angkor Wat, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's one of the world's largest temple complexes dedicated to Lord Vishnu, right? So India has played a role in restoring some of these archaeological sites, in protecting the cultural monuments. So all these cultural initiatives have been taken up, which is a major success under Look East. We have promoted tourism. We have taken up many key connectivity projects, which we have studied in previous classes already. The Kaladan project with Myanmar, the IMT Trilateral Highway with Myanmar and Thailand, right? All these are major connectivity initiatives. We have increased air connectivity. Today, you have plenty of direct flights between India and Southeast Asia, right? Maritime connectivity has been improved. So this is how we have tackled the challenges, the hurdles to improve trade, to promote our strategic ties and bring the two sides closer. So these are the broad contours of Look East policy. There are many successes, many successful initiatives under it. So we try to improve and upgrade this initiative by launching the Act East policy in 2014. In 2014, we were dealing with the rising Chinese threat. China's influence, its aggression, had gone up significantly in the Indo-Pacific. We have studied how China has picked up multiple maritime disputes in the South China Sea. Correct? The US was also focusing more on the Asia Pacific under its pivot to Asia policy. And it was encouraging India to act east, to act as a counter to Chinese aggression across the region. The US realigned its foreign policy to focus more on Asia Pacific, particularly Southeast Asia and East Asia. It saw India as a counterweight to balance China, right? So all these developments led India to launch Act East policy in 2014. So this is a upgraded version, an improved version of the Look East. And the important point here is that PM Modi announced the change from Look East to Act East when he was participating in the ASEAN summit, which was held in Myanmar that year. This was a symbolic gesture from India. It was a symbolic message that Myanmar is a focus country for us under this policy. It simply highlighted the fact that Myanmar is a bridge connecting India and Southeast Asia. See, India could have announced the policy anywhere, but we chose the occasion carefully. In 2014, Myanmar was hosting the East Asia Summit and ASEAN Summit. PM Modi was participating in the summit as part of the Look East policy of India. So during this visit, while we were taking part in the ASEAN East Asia Summit, that is when PM Modi announced the change, the transformation from Look East to Act East. So there is a careful message that India was sending out, a symbolic message. The message was to Myanmar. We announced the initiative on the soil of Myanmar to show that Myanmar is the starting point. This is where our Look East Act East policy begins. We see Myanmar as a vital connect, a link that brings India closer to Southeast Asia. So in the last 8 years, India has paid a lot of attention to Act East policy as it is an integral part of our Indo-Pacific initiative. India has been paying a lot of attention to the Indo-Pacific, given the changing geopolitics of the region, with the primary intention of countering Chinese aggression. So as part of our Indo-Pacific strategy, Act East policy becomes critical because it applies to Southeast Asia and East Asia. Is that clear? So today, there are some changes that you can see in this policy. You can see some clear changes, clear improvements. That is why I called it an upgraded version, a better, improved version. It is an upgraded version of Look East policy. Never say that Act East policy is very different from Look East, because it's not. Yes, there are some minor changes. There is a change in approach, a change in the way we are implementing some initiatives, but does not mean Act East and Look East are entirely different. They're not diametrically opposite. Rather, they are very similar because we are trying to fix the shortcomings of Look East. Even though Look East policy was a big success, there were some shortcomings. There were some areas where we could have done better, right? So to address those shortcomings, this upgraded policy was launched called Act East. Now let us see the core features of Act East. You'll understand how it is an upgraded version of Look East. You'll also understand the shortcomings of the Look East policy. All right, let's start with the first point. One major upgrade that you see is that under Act East, there is more focus on tangible action and achieving concrete results. What does that mean? It means that under Look East policy, we were promising a lot. We would start a lot of initiatives, sign many agreements, but we would fail in implementation. I'll even give you an example to justify this argument of mine. Remember, we spoke about Kaladan project, IMT highway. If you guys go back to this discussion, I told you that these policies, these key connectivity projects, they were launched under Look East policy, proposed under Look East policy. But even today, we haven't completed them. Kaladan is still pending. Only part of it has been opened. IMT highway is almost nearing completion, but we haven't been able to launch the project. These projects have been delayed, and partly India has failed as well. The entire blame is not on India, because in Myanmar, the constant crisis has created a challenge for us. Remember, we had studied this, the presence of insurgent groups, the military takeover, the Rohingya crisis. All these challenging situations have affected these projects. Myanmar has been under sanctions for many, many years, where Western countries have targeted the country with economic sanctions. Western countries have even put pressure on India to cut off ties with Myanmar, to join the sanctions against Myanmar. Even though we resisted the Western pressure, we bypassed the Western sanctions, it was still difficult for India to execute the projects, to provide the funding on time, to construct the projects on time. Because of the security situation, the political situation, it became difficult for India. Plus, there were some shortcomings on India's side. We couldn't arrange the funds on time. We couldn't execute the construction as planned and promised. So this is one area where we were lacking. Even with regard to trade, we would plan a lot of initiatives, promise and start, but it wouldn't be completed. So that is one area which has been prioritized, to pay more attention to achieving concrete results, to take tangible action, measurable, quantifiable action, so that we can measure the progress that we are making. That's why I told you it's not a different policy, it's an upgraded policy. Next, another change you notice is that under the Look East, we ended up focusing more on Southeast Asia, and we gave less attention to East Asia. This was a reality. Even though we said that Look East focuses on Southeast and East Asia, both the regions, eventually after 20 years, we realized that we had paid more attention to Southeast Asia. There was a lot of improvements with Southeast Asia, but we hadn't given the same attention to East Asia and the larger Pacific region, which means we hadn't focused much on Japan, on South Korea, on Australia and other parts of the Pacific. So under Act East, you are seeing a renewed focus and attention towards the eastern parts of the Pacific, the North and South Pacific, towards East Asia. There is greater attention to improve our ties with Japan or Australia or South Korea, even New Zealand, the Pacific Island countries, which I was mentioning. We are working closely with US to push our influence across East Asia and the Pacific. That is another big change that you notice. Even under Look East, East Asia was supposed to be a focus, but over a period of time, we hadn't given much attention to that region. We were more focused on Southeast Asia region. So under Act East, we are paying equal attention, not just to Southeast Asia, but across the Pacific, across East Asia, including North and South Pacific. That is another big difference that you notice. Next, third point. India has shown more boldness in the defense, security, and strategic domain. under Act East. See, under Look East also we had said that defense security relations are important, but we didn't see much progress because under Look East, economic relations occupied most of the time. Under Look East, economic ties and cultural ties had improved, whereas less attention had been given to defense and strategic issues. Even though we had said that we will prioritize defense security relations, this had not been a focus. Our attention was largely on economic and cultural ties, where we saw more progress with very limited progress in the defense and strategic domain. So this is one improvement we have made. In Act East, we are not only focusing on economic ties and cultural ties, but we are also trying to be very bold and proactive when it comes to defense, security issues, and strategic cooperation. That's why you see more military cooperation with these countries. We have a lot of military exercises planned. We have very close cooperation in the maritime security domain. We are working together to tackle organized crime, to tackle terrorism. All right? We are focusing on HADR operations in the field of disaster management. More military exercises and defense trade is also noticeable under Act East policy. There are plenty of examples. All right, I can give you one example. Recently, we have agreed to sell the BrahMos cruise missile to one of the Southeast Asian countries. Previously, India was a little hesitant to sell advanced weaponry to some of these countries because we didn't want to trigger China unnecessarily. Now that China is constantly poking at India, India also has decided to retaliate by backing some countries in the military domain. Previously, we did have good defense relations with Vietnam. All right, but it wasn't enough. Now India is more proactive. We are working closely with Japan, with Australia, with Vietnam, and many others. We are conducting multiple military exercises. Some of the exercises were there, but it wasn't a priority. It wasn't a major attention point. Now we are giving more focus on these military exercises, and we have even signed a contract recently to export BrahMos cruise missile to a Southeast Asian country. Do you know which country? Which country has signed a contract with India for the BrahMos? Not Vietnam, not Indonesia. Very good. Many others have got it right. Ravi, Vaishnav, Vijay, then Pratyaksh, Sai, Dinesh, Atharv. All of them have got the right answer. Very good. It's with Philippines. Remember, we studied under South China Sea dispute. So China has been very hostile to Philippines with regard to the South China Sea conflict. So we have recently signed a contract to export the BrahMos cruise missile. BrahMos is one of the world's fastest cruise missiles. It can be very accurate in targeting even ships or even land-based targets. So India's agreement to sell the BrahMos to Philippines is of great strategic significance. We are stepping up our defense ties with traditional defense partners like Vietnam, Japan, and Australia. So you see a greater boldness from India's side in the defense, security, and strategic domain. I'm not saying it was absent before. It was there before as well. As I told you, we had good defense relations with Vietnam. Some of the military exercises were there for many years. But there is greater boldness, greater proactiveness from India's side. That is one upgrade you see in Act East policy. Next, along with building cordial relations and cooperation, we are taking a stronger stand in negotiations with ASEAN. We are basically bargaining more strongly with ASEAN. We are becoming hard-nosed. This became necessary because of the free trade agreement. Let me explain this. See, I told you that India signed a free trade agreement with ASEAN. This agreement covers goods, services, and investments. Is that clear? We signed one FTA in 2007 and one more in 2011. So they were implemented a few years later. The agreement in goods came into force from 2010, and the agreement in services and investments was implemented from 2015. So this was a free trade agreement. All right. Initially, the agreement covered only goods. Later, services and investments were also covered. So they came into force. They increased the trade between both the sides. Exports increased for both the sides. So this was all good development. It was a positive news. But later we realized that there were some problems. Because FTA is all about how you negotiate. Sometimes if FTAs are not well negotiated, if there are gaps and shortcomings, it might end up creating problems because it might flood our market with cheap imports from some of these countries. Since you have reduced the taxes, the tariff barriers, you have improved trade, there is a freer movement of goods happening, right? So exports will rise for both countries will benefit, a lot of jobs will be created, new investments will come. That's great for everyone involved. But in some sectors, if you haven't taken precaution, if you haven't negotiated strongly, there might be a flood of cheap imports into your country which could harm your domestic industry. Our domestic producers, that is our farmers, our MSME industry, our manufacturing industry, they may not be so competitive. They may not be prepared to deal with competition from other countries. So in some sectors, you will feel the pinch where domestic players will get wiped out of competition because of the flood of cheap imports. We saw this happening in some sectors like coconut, coffee, etc. All right. I'll give you an example. See, Thailand and Indonesia, they are leading producers of coconut. And these countries, they have made a lot of innovation in the food processing sector. They not only export coconut, but they derive many products from it. They take the tender coconut water, the flesh, right? And they turn that into hundreds of products, from coconut cream to juices, jams, jellies, whatnot. That is their strength. They have built that strength. They are highly competitive in this sector. Whereas in India, our coconut industry was not so evolved. We were simply exporting the raw material, consuming the basic forms of coconut without much focus on food processing. We never reduced wastage. We didn't have the logistics. Enough cold storage wasn't available. Enough food processing technology was not introduced. So what happened? The coconut producers in, let's say, states like Kerala, their produce took a massive hit. Now you go to any grocery shop, right, especially the supermarkets, you would have noticed a change in the last 8 years. Lot of Southeast Asian food items are available, which was not there before. From noodles to sauces, right? Your Thai red curry, Thai green curry sauces, and various coconut-based jellies, drinks, etc. These commodities which entered the Indian market, they took over some of the market share. So domestic producers in India took a hit. Their produce wouldn't compete with the quality, with the changes, the value addition that they were making. So cheaper imports flooded the market, harming domestic producers in Kerala and other states. The same happened with Vietnamese coffee. Vietnam is known for its coffee, just like India and other countries. Vietnam's coffee, which has its own unique flavor, taste, and it's also quite cheaper, it flooded the Indian market, hurting domestic coffee production in Karnataka. Karnataka is a major coffee producer, right? Along with few other states. So coffee producers in India took a hit because of cheaper Vietnamese coffee flooding the Indian market. This is just one example I'm giving you. There were many other sectors where this happened, where Southeast Asian countries, they took advantage of their inherent strength, their economic strength, and flooded the Indian market with cheaper imports, and we didn't have any protection against it. So our domestic producers started taking a hit. So that is where India realized that we should have negotiated better. We should have foreseen what might happen. We should have been more hard-nosed in negotiations and taken a stronger position. At that point in time, we didn't realize, because this was one of our first experiences with a major FTA. So based on this experience, we have drawn some lessons. We have learned from these mistakes. So now India doesn't want to be on a weaker foot. We will be very close to them. We'll be friendly. We'll cooperate with them. But when it comes to core interests, we will not compromise. We will be hard-nosed as well. We'll bargain harder to get the best deal possible for both the parties. A trade agreement shouldn't favor just one side. It should favor both the parties involved. So that is a change you see in Act East policy, where India is more hard-nosed in its negotiations. Is that clear? Let me explain one more problem we had with ASEAN FTA. Under ASEAN FTA, rules of origin has not been mentioned. Let me tell you what this issue is all about. When you don't specify where the commodity is originating from, right? Under the FTA, the benefit of free trade, the benefit of lower taxes, and all the benefits given under the trade agreement, it should apply only for those goods that are genuinely produced in India and ASEAN region. Correct? Now, let's say, for example, there is a mobile phone produced in Southeast Asian countries. From there, the product is being exported to India, right? This mobile phone, which was largely produced in Southeast Asia, most of it, let's say 60%, 70% of it was produced and assembled in Southeast Asia. Then such a product deserves the better treatment under free trade agreement. Because it's a Southeast Asian product, largely it has been produced and assembled there, and then it's being exported to India. So this product deserves free trade benefits. Now, what if a third party, let's say a Chinese exporter, India has imposed anti-dumping duties. Let's say we have imposed anti-dumping duties on this product which China has been dumping on the Indian market. Let's take the same example, hypothetical example. Let's say there is a Chinese mobile manufacturer. They're mass producing mobile phones in China because they have the scale, the potential. They are on the Indian market, which is by raising the duties, by imposing anti-dumping duties. So now this Chinese phone cannot be exported to India cheaply. The cost will go up because of the anti-dumping duties. Now, what the exporter can do, the Chinese exporter, he will see that India, ASEAN countries have a FTA. There is a free trade route available. But the trade route between India and China has a block. There is an anti-dumping duty placed. Now, instead of exporting the phone from China to India directly, where the price increases because of anti-dumping duty, this exporter might route that phone from a Southeast Asian country to India. He might export the phones, let's say, to Thailand or Singapore or Malaysia. They will create fake documents showing that the product is produced here. They'll make nominal changes. They will repackage it or they'll assemble it there to show that it's a Southeast Asian product when it is not. It's actually a Chinese product. And then they will misuse the FTA route. Third party countries and exporters can misuse this route to get the benefit of free trade arrangement and dump those products indirectly on our market. So despite anti-dumping duties imposed on this product against China, the exporters might find another route through the FTA route and they might export them from ASEAN countries to India. We will never know that it has been rerouted. because there are no rules of origin requirement. But in a free trade agreement, if you include rules of origin requirement and specify the minimum value addition that has to be done, then you can block such misuse of FTA. You can block third parties, third countries, third party exporters from misusing the FTA route. This key provision is missing under India-ASEAN FTA. Got it? You can specify that for a product to be eligible for free trade benefits, if it has to enter India freely, there should be a minimum percentage of value addition done in Southeast Asia. Maybe 50%, 60%, 70%. You can't say 100% because in a globalized world, no commodity is entirely produced in one country, right? Some components should have come from China, some from Europe, some from Taiwan, some from India. That's how a globalized economy works. The final product you receive, it would have gone through multiple countries. The various components would have come from multiple places. You can't specify 100% requirement. That would be unfair. It will not benefit both the sides. So you can specify a minimum percentage for value addition. If such percentage of value addition is done, you can prove that, then we'll treat it as a Southeast Asian product and it will enjoy the benefit of free trade. The same will apply for India as well. So both the sides can be protected from any such misuse by third parties and third countries by implementing rules of origin requirement. They have to specify where the commodity is originating from, how much percentage value addition was done in that country. So by doing that, you can filter out those commodities which are trying to misuse the FTA route. Is that clear? So this is missing in India-ASEAN FTA. We have seen cases where Chinese exporters and other third-party exporters have misused this FTA route to push cheaper imports into India via ASEAN countries. Understood? And the other problem with this FTA is that there is no review mechanism, no dispute settlement mechanism. This is another lesson we have learned. When you negotiate an FTA, there should be an inbuilt periodic review that every 3 years, every 5 years, we will review the FTA. We'll identify the problems and we'll address them. And there should also be a dispute settlement mechanism. If any disputes come up, to settle them in a fair manner, there should be dispute settlement mechanism. These provisions are missing. So this is the lesson we have learned. That is why we want to be more hard-nosed while negotiating with ASEAN. That is one upgrade you see in Act East policy. Now, why did I stress on all these points? Why did I go into the depth? It's because in the last year, we have signed important free trade agreements with other countries. I hope you know. Let me know in the comments if you're aware of the recent FTAs we have signed. There, we have included all these provisions. Pratyaksh has given the right answer. Even Abhijit, Amit, Mauli and Kamalpal. Very good. We signed a trade agreement with Australia last year. And we have signed a very important trade agreement with United Arab Emirates. We will discuss this in the later class today or let's say tomorrow and day after. So in these new FTAs we have started signing. We are negotiating many free FTAs as well with others. We are incorporating all these lessons. So ASEAN FTA was an experience for India, one of the first time experiences. So we are drawing those lessons from the shortcomings and implementing them going forward. So with ASEAN, we have decided to be more hard-nosed in negotiations, to take a stronger stand, to protect our core interests. And that is one upgrade you see in Act East policy compared to Look East policy. And there is a sharper focus on the Northeast region and connecting it with Southeast Asia. This focus was there before as well, but it wasn't enough. Now there is a greater focus and attention on bringing Northeast India closer to Southeast Asian markets. Is that clear? These are the major changes or upgrades that you notice in Act East policy compared to Look East policy. So you can anticipate a mains question here. You should be prepared for this. UPSC might ask you, what's the difference between Look East and Act East? How is it an upgraded version? Or UPSC might ask you to analyze the evolution of this policy, the reason why India launched Look East policy in 91, and how we have upgraded in 2014 to the Act East policy. This can come as a 15-mark question, so please be prepared for this topic. All right. Now, let us see how the defense relations, the maritime security ties, and strategic ties are improving. I want to give an example here. In this map, you can see a very, very important port called the Sabang port. All right. Can you see this port here, the Sabang port? Any idea where it is located? In which part or in which country? Where is Sabang port located? Have you heard of it? Vietnam. Vietnam is here, far away from Sabang port. Vietnam is incorrect. Malaysia, Myanmar, no. Thailand. Very few students have got it right. Varsha, Vijay, Vaishna, and few others. What is this place, this island? This is Sumatra, located next to our Andaman Nicobar Islands. Sumatra is part of Indonesia. So recently we have signed an agreement with Indonesia to get port access to the strategic Sabang port. Sabang port is not just a commercial port used for shipping, it's also a naval base of the Indonesian Navy. It is right next to our Andaman Nicobar Islands, and it's present at the opening of Malacca Strait. This is Malacca Strait, the choke point. So near Malacca Strait, India has gained port access to a strategic port, the Sabang port. So Indian Navy can use this port facility for logistical support. That is to get refueling, resupplies, through which we can increase our operational range. Because see, we are increasing our deployment into South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. We have started sending more ships, submarines, and aircrafts to South China Sea, Pacific, and even to Australia. We are frequently deploying our military assets here. So you can't expect the ships and vessels and aircrafts to come back to India all the time for refueling and resupplies. We will need logistical support everywhere in between. So Sabang port becomes one such facility where Indonesia will give logistical support to Indian vessels and Indian aircraft if required. This will increase our operational range. It will increase our military power projection across the Pacific. All right. We have similar arrangements with Japan and with Australia. Even they are providing logistical support to India, and it's a reciprocal treatment. We have also agreed to give the same support to Japan and Australia. So Japanese vessels, Australian aircrafts, when they come near Arabian Sea or Bay of Bengal, they need not go back for refueling and resupplies. India will provide those facilities. Sometimes aircrafts or ships might break down, requiring repairs and servicing. Even those facilities will be extended. So this is one big change you're seeing. In the defense, security, strategic domain, we have gotten much closer to these countries. We have gained port access to Sabang port in Indonesia. We have signed logistics agreement with Japan and Australia. All right. We have very close defense relations with Vietnam, with Singapore. We've already studied Myanmar. We spoke about the military relations, how we gifted a submarine as well to Myanmar's Navy. We work closely with Thailand as well. Recently, we've agreed to export BrahMos to Philippines. Correct? It's also being reported that BrahMos, after the BrahMos deal, Philippines is showing interest to procure the Tejas fighter jet and ALH helicopters. These are proposals. There are negotiations going on where Philippines has reportedly shown interest in the LCA, light combat aircraft, the Tejas fighter jet, which is indigenously developed, and the ALH Dhruv helicopter. Right? We have many military exercises, close defense relations with several of these countries. So that is a key change that you can notice in our Act East policy. It's a better defense outreach towards Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. Is that clear? So this completes one part of the discussion of this chapter. Now we can start with the next part. I'll just give you the introduction. We can stop after that because we are almost reaching the end of today's class. So now in the next part, what I will do is I'll pick up the important countries from the region. You don't have to sit and study all the countries. It's impossible. UPSC will not ask you about all the countries. Now that we know the whole approach and focus of India and the big initiatives of India, we have to just pick up the important ones which are in the news in the last 3-4 years. So from Southeast and East Asia and the broader Pacific, Japan, Vietnam, Australia are the most important. Is that clear? So we will start with India-Japan relations. We'll get a brief understanding of India-Japan ties, and then we'll do the same with Vietnam and Australia. After that, we'll come to the last part, which is the major groupings, the regional organizations from this region. Today, let's begin this discussion. We can wrap it up tomorrow. Let's spend maybe 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. I'll just give you the introduction and we can resume this tomorrow. See, Japan is a major East Asian power, right? Especially after 1945, after the Second World War. Japan is a transformed country today. In previous classes, I had mentioned how imperial fascist Japan was a brutal country at one point. It had committed atrocities all across Asia. It had aligned with Hitler's Nazi Germany. It had aligned with the Axis powers, committing atrocities all across Asia. Right? In China, in Southeast Asia, in Korea, Japanese forces, the fascist imperial Japanese forces, they had committed brutal war crimes and atrocities. Even today, there is a historical hatred towards Japan. Even though the present people of Japan or government are not responsible, right? They're apologetic. They're highly sorry for what happened, what their ancestors did. But still, there is a sense of hatred and resentment across Asian countries against Japan for what the imperial fascist forces had done. All right? So the Japan before 1945 was very, very different. The Japan after 1945 is completely different. Historically, if you, let's say, go back few centuries, since ancient medieval times, India did have a cultural connect in the form of Buddhism. Buddhism has been a strong bond. Buddhism has traveled far and wide. Even in South Korea and Japan, there is a strong Buddhist influence with a deep-rooted connection with India. Right? Today as well, you can see those close cultural links. Several Japanese tourists, they come to India to visit the Buddhist sites. There is a link with Ayodhya as well, a cultural link. Then Tamil movies in particular. There is a huge appeal here that represents the cultural people-to-people relations. Remember, I had mentioned the similarities between Tamil and Korean language, the linguistic similarities. Several words in Tamil, right? You can see the exact replica, almost pronunciations also the same in Korean language. They all show the deep-rooted civilizational historical links. Right? Japan as well has this connection with India through Buddhism, the modern connect through popular culture like music, movies, etc. There are a lot of Indians today settled in Japan, working, studying in Japan, right? But at one point, we were on the opposite sides. During the World War, Japan was with Axis powers committing atrocities, whereas India was playing a critical role in helping the Allied powers. Indian soldiers made one of the biggest contributions during the World War, both First and Second World War. Right? We fought on behalf of British India, on behalf of the Allied powers to defeat the Axis powers. So there is a point where Indian and Japanese forces were locked in a conflict near Nagaland. Near Nagaland and Myanmar, Japanese forces had managed to take over most of Southeast Asia, right? After these brutal battles, and they had kept their eyes on British India. So in the northeast, near today's Nagaland, Myanmar, in that border area, Indian troops fought against Japanese troops. We managed to push them back. So we were on the opposite end of the conflict during Second World War. But however, there is another angle as well where the Indian National Army, headed by Subhash Chandra Bose, had sought support from Imperial Fascist Japan. Subhash Chandra Bose, who was trying to lead a armed rebellion against British rule, right? He sought support from the enemies of Britain. He reached out to Nazi Germany. He met Hitler, tried organizing military and weapon support, and later even reached Japan to bring that military support needed to fight this war of liberation against British colonial rule. Right? Unfortunately, Subhash Chandra Bose would fail in his efforts, but still, he made a remarkable contribution to our freedom struggle and formed a direct connect between India and Japan. So it's very interesting to know this link, where on one hand we were fighting against Japan, right, because these were evil fascist forces committing war crimes and mass atrocities, aligned with Hitler's Germany, committing brutal violations across the world, while our freedom fighters sought support as well, right? Not because we aligned with their ideology, but because they were enemies of our enemy. They were enemies of Britain, whom we wanted to throw out. So that is a very interesting connection we have here with Japan prior to 1945. But after 1945, things changed completely. Of course, all the Axis powers were defeated, right? Japan was forced to surrender following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As you all know, it's the only country to have seen nuclear war, right? The US decided to bring the war to an end because Japanese forces were not surrendering. The war had ended in Europe, but still the war continued in Asia. So to force Japan's surrender, US used the nuclear bombs and dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's a trending topic as well because of the Oppenheimer movie, right? And of course, I'm sure many of you know this history as well. So as Japan surrendered after this, the US transformed Japan. It introduced a political transformation, a constitutional transformation in Japan. Because the US was very clear that we cannot allow Japan to repeat the same mistakes. The mistakes made by fascist Imperial Japan cannot be allowed to happen again. So basically, the war and military capabilities of Japan were taken away by the US. As Allied powers clearly won, they could impose what they wanted on the defeated Axis powers. The fascist government was thrown out, and on Japan, a complete transformation was imposed. The US demilitarized Japan. Japan did not have military forces. It was prohibited from having military forces under its new constitution, which was a pacifist constitution. All right, this is the last point, and I'll stop after this. Under the pacifist constitution that was adopted under the guidance of US, Japan is prohibited from taking any offensive action. It is prohibited from going to war against another country, meaning it can't trigger the conflict. It can't aggressively target another country. It gave up nuclear weapons forever as the only country which has suffered the horrors of nuclear war, right? There's no one else in the world who better understand the consequences of nuclear war than the Japanese. So they permanently swore away from nuclear technology and nuclear weapons. See, Japan, if it wants, even today, it can develop a nuclear bomb within days, within months. But Japan has given a strong commitment to non-proliferation treaty. It is opposed to nuclear weapons. It has an ideological opposition. It opposes nuclear weapons and nuclear arms race. It has only developed civilian nuclear technology for medical purposes, for generating electricity, etc. It has never pursued nuclear weapons following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is hard coded into its constitution. It's a pacifist constitution, meaning Japan is a pacifist power. It can't be aggressive. It can't take aggressive action. At one point, it was demilitarized. It did not have military forces. They were disbanded by the US. It was prohibited from attacking another country, prohibited from taking offensive action, and gave up nuclear weapons. In return, US promised to defend Japan. The US committed military support. It stationed troops, stationed nuclear weapons as well later, saying that US will protect Japan if required. And this was followed for many years. Now you might ask, sir, if Japan does not have military forces, then how come India has exercises with Japan? I just told you about Malabar exercise, right, in previous classes. How does those exercises happen? These military exercises are held with the self-defense forces of Japan. Japan does not have regular armed forces like other countries. For many years, it did not have any armed forces because it was demilitarized. But later, since it was threatened by China and North Korea and Russia, right, it has territorial disputes with all of them. Japan made a small amendment to the constitution through which self-defense forces have been raised, meaning Japan can defend itself. It can't attack. It can't take up offensive action. So even today, Japan follows the same constitution. No nuclear weapons, no triggering war, no taking offensive action against others. It can't get aggressive. That provision still exists. But it has only raised self-defense forces to defend the country. So there is a self-defense army, self-defense navy, self-defense air force. Their training, their methodology of operations are very different. They're not trained for aggressive action. They're not trained for offensive operations. They're trained only for defensive operations. Is that clear? So Japan is a pacifist country. There is a debate in the last few years, especially with increasing threat from China. There is a debate going on in Japan to abandon the pacifist nature of the constitution. There is a demand to build aggressive defense forces like other countries and give up the provision on no war and no offensive action. But this is still a debate. It's still a proposal. And even today, it follows the pacifist constitution where it enjoys the protection of the US. That is why US is a close defense partner for Japan. US has guaranteed Japan's security and Japan has its own self-defense forces. All right. So I think this is enough for now. We can resume the discussion tomorrow. We'll continue from here. We'll quickly cover India, Japan, Vietnam, Australia, wrap up this whole chapter, and then look at West Asia and Central Asia. All right. So I hope you guys have understood everything. Let's see if there are any questions. Prashant is asking, free trade agreement can be revoked. See, problem is if you revoke your international commitments, you can do that. As a sovereign country, you have every right to cancel an agreement, to cancel your involvement with any deal. Problem is, tomorrow no one will trust you. If you make a promise and then retract, right? You become an unreliable actor. Let's say you say that, sir, I'll study for 10 hours, I'll write all the answers, and tomorrow you score low in the exam, or you quit from UPSC preparation, right? Tomorrow I'll have no faith in you that you will prepare well for the exam. The same thing happens here in international relations. If countries make commitments and promises and then quit all of a sudden, slowly others will lose trust in them. They'll not see them as reliable partners. So that's why it's not easy to quit a agreement or a deal. Ravi is asking, what if US-Japan relations are affected? Then how will it defend itself from China and North Korea? See, US relations with Japan will not be affected. They are very, very close allies of each other. They are very closely interlinked in the defense domain, right? Even in that worst case scenario where US-Japan relations are affected, which is hypothetical, if it still happens, Japan can always rebuild its defense forces and protect itself. It has required resources for that. Vivek is asking, did India choose USSR by will or compulsion? It was both. Compulsion from the US, as US was threatening India, creating problems for India. So then we made a choice to align with Soviet Union. So it was both compulsion and will. Sir, please provide insights regarding India's relations with North Korea. Not required. India-North Korea will not be an important topic. Don't worry. We will mention North Korea's nuclear program where required, where necessary. Apart from that, India-North Korea ties are not important. Vijay is asking, has India joined the Silk Road initiative of China? No. I told this many times in previous classes. We are opposed to the Belt and Road initiative of China. Sakshi is asking, can we upgrade the FTA by adding rules of origin requirement? We can, but ASEAN has to agree to that. We are pushing for that, but ASEAN countries are not agreeing for renegotiation. That's why I told you there's no review mechanism. If review mechanism was there, it would be an obligation for both sides to review and upgrade. But since it's not there, ASEAN is refusing to renegotiate, but we are pushing. We are trying to push every time to renegotiate the FTA. All right. So guys, these are some of the questions. I hope again it was an interesting session. I hope you understood everything. If you have any doubts, please write to iaslive@byju's.com. On Saturday, we'll take up all your doubts. We'll have a separate session for that. Is that clear? So please revise whatever we have studied. Tomorrow, day after, we'll be wrapping up Southeast Asia, East Asia. We'll also cover West Asia and Central Asia, right? Then we'll have few small topics like the big powers and UN. We'll wrap it up on Saturday and also look at the doubts and questions. So that is it from my side. Let's see you tomorrow then. Till then, take care. Have a good night.